He found her at the gatepost. Fingers, blue lips, the color of a bruise. Her body folded into the snow like something that had been thrown away. And that was exactly what had happened. Her own family had left her there, in the blizzard, on purpose. Ethan Walker had $12 to his name and a roof that leaked. He had nothing to offer her except the one thing she hadn't had in 27 years. Someone who refused to walk away. If this story moves something in you, subscribe right now. Hit that bell and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The winter of 1882 came to the Wyoming Territory without warning and without mercy. It did not drift in gently, the way winters sometimes do, giving cattle and men alike a few days to prepare to stack wood and pull animals into the barn and stuff rags under the door frames. It came the way grief comes, sudden and total, a white wall dropping out of a sky that had been pale and quiet just the afternoon before. By the time Ethan Walker rode back from the Caldwell property that Tuesday evening, the temperature had already dropped 20 degrees, and the wind was something that didn't have a proper name. It wasn't gusting. It wasn't howling. It was pressing. Pressing against the side of his horse, pressing against the wool coat he'd had for 6 years, pressing against every inch of exposed skin, like it had made a personal decision about him. His horse, a brown quarter horse named Rye, didn't like it one bit. Rye kept tossing his head and trying to cut toward the tree line, and Ethan kept steering him back, one hand on the reins and one pulled inside his coat against his chest. "I know," he said. "I know. Half a mile." That was how he talked to Rye. Short sentences. Honest ones. The horse seemed to appreciate not being lied to. Ethan Walker was 34 years old, and he had spent the better part of the last decade learning how to survive on not enough of everything, not enough money, not enough men to run the property he rented from old Gerald Hatch, not enough hours in the day to repair everything that needed repairing, plant everything that needed planting, fix everything. The weather and the years and simple bad luck kept breaking. I was not a man who complained about this. He had decided sometime around his 27th birthday that complaining was a form of spending and he couldn't afford it. What he could afford barely was the 40 acres he leased from Hatch, a small herd of cattle that he'd built up one animal at a time, and the one-room cabin at the edge of the property that leaked when it rained and froze when it didn't. He'd spent 3 summers trying to get ahead enough to buy the land outright. He wasn't there yet, but he wasn't going backwards either. That was the goal. Don't go backwards. I was thinking about the back fence, the one the wind had likely already damaged, the one he'd been meaning to reinforce for 2 weeks, when Rye stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. All 4 hooves, planted ears, pitched forward into the dark and the white. "What is it?" Rye didn't move. Ethan stood up slightly in the stirrups and looked ahead. The snow was coming sideways now, thick enough that the tree line at the edge of his property was just a dark smear in the white. The trail leading to his gate was barely visible. He could see maybe 30 feet ahead. Then he saw something that wasn't the trail. A shape. Low. Crumpled against the left fence post of his gate like something the wind had pushed there and left. For 3 full seconds, he didn't move. His mind went through the options the way a careful man's mind does downed calf-broken sack of something he'd left out, trick of the storm, and his tired eyes. Then the shape moved. One hand, slow and weak, lifting and falling back into the snow. Ethan was off Rye before he'd made any conscious decision about it. He came down into snow that went to his knee and pushed forward with his head ducked against the wind. One arm up across his face, and when he reached the fence post and dropped to a crouch, he saw her clearly for the first time. A woman. Young. 20-something. Dark hair plastered to her face and neck soaked through. She was wearing a traveling coat, the kind women wore in towns, not the kind meant for weather like this, and it was completely inadequate. The fabric was thin and fashionable, and it was killing her. Her lips were the color of a bruise. "Hey." He grabbed her shoulder with one hand, not gently because there wasn't time for gentle. "Hey, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, slow, like the lids were weighted. She looked at him, and whatever she saw, a stranger looming over her in a blizzard, a rough-faced man she didn't know, a person who could have been anyone at all. She did not look afraid. She looked at him the way a person looks when they have already made their peace and are only mildly surprised the story isn't over. "I can hear you," she said. The words were almost nothing, just shaped air. "Can you stand?" A pause. Then, with what appeared to be the last reserves of her dignity, "I don't know." "Try." She tried. She got one arm under herself and pushed, and made it about 6 inches before her elbow gave. Ethan caught her before she went back down. "All right," he said. "All right, that's fine." He got one arm behind her back and one under her knees and stood up with her. She weighed less than he expected, which worried him more than if she'd been heavy. Her body was rigid with cold. "My bag," she said, the faintest note of stubbornness in it. He looked. There was a travel bag in the snow beside the fence post, half buried already. He grabbed the strap with the same hand he'd used to grip her knees, which was awkward and probably looked ridiculous, but he managed. "Got it." She didn't thank him. She tucked her face against his chest, the way a person does when they have simply run out of anything else to do. He carried her to the cabin. The fire took longer than it should have because his hands were shaking, not from fear, just from cold, and he kept dropping the matches. He finally got the kindling going, added 2 logs, and turned around to find her sitting exactly where he'd put her on the edge of the one chair in the room, shaking so hard her teeth were clicking together in a way he could hear from across the cabin. "You need to get out of that coat," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not asking for any reason except that it's wet, and it'll make things worse. You keep it on. You'll shake all night, even with the fire." A long pause. Then she reached for the buttons herself. Her fingers weren't working right, and she struggled with it. And after a moment, he crossed the room and he said, "May I?" and waited until she nodded before he helped her with the last 2 buttons and took the coat and hung it near the fire. He got her a wool blanket, the better one, the one he usually kept on the bed rather than the chair, and a tin cup of water that he'd warmed by the fire until it wasn't cold anymore. She wrapped both hands around the cup and held it like it was the most valuable thing she'd ever touched. He pulled the second chair to the other side of the room and sat down. "You want to tell me how you got to my fence post?" he asked. She drank some of the water. Her color was beginning to come back, which was a relief. "The wagon broke," she said. "Where the main road. About a mile, I think. Maybe more. I lost track." He thought about the main road. A mile in this storm, in those clothes, in those shoes, which he could see now were completely wrong for this terrain. Thin leather with small heels was nothing short of a miracle. "You walked a mile in those shoes." She looked down at them like she was noticing them herself for the first time. "I couldn't stay with the wagon." "Why not?" Something shifted in her face. Just briefly. Then she looked at the fire and said, "The driver left." "Left you?" "Yes." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind made a sound like a long and miserable argument. "On purpose?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was very even. "My family hired him to take me to the next town. I believe somewhere between the starting point and the storm, they changed his instructions." He stared at her. "Your family told him to leave you?" "I believe so, yes." He sat back in his chair. He'd heard a lot of things in his life. He'd heard of men stealing cattle and burning crops and spreading lies about their neighbors over water rights. He'd heard of fathers who drank away farms, and mothers who worked themselves to death, and brothers who turned on each other over a few $100s of inheritance. He thought he'd heard most of the shapes that cruelty took out here. "Why?" he finally asked. She looked at him then, straight on. Those dark eyes were very clear now, the shock burning off, and something steadier replacing it. "Because I refused to marry a man I did not choose." The fire crackled. "That's it," he said. "That's it." He rubbed the back of his neck. "What's your name?" "Charlotte. Charlotte Hayes." Hayes. He knew that name. Anyone in the territory knew that name. The Hayes family owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, more land than Ethan had ever stood on in his life, more cattle than he'd ever counted. Margaret and Robert Hayes. The family that had built half of Millard Creek's Main Street whose name was on the bank building and the church and the water tower. This woman shaking in his only good chair, wrapped in his wool blanket, drinking warm water from a tin cup that had a dent in it, was that Hayes. He kept his face even. "Ethan Walker," he said. She nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Walker." "Ethan," another nod. "Thank you, Ethan." He looked at the coat drying by the fire. He looked at the bag sitting beside the door, half its buckle missing. Then he looked at her hands around the cup, steady now mostly, but still with a faint tremor she was trying very hard not to show. "You're not going anywhere tonight," he said. "Storm's going to be worse before it's better." "I understand." "Bed's yours. I'll sleep in the chair." She opened her mouth like she was going to argue, and he held up one hand. "Don't. It's not a debate." She closed her mouth. And then very quietly she said, "I'm not used to people deciding things for my benefit." "Well," he said, standing up and moving to add another log to the fire. "You're not in your world right now. You're in mine. And in mine, the person who nearly froze to death gets the bed." She slept for 11 hours. He didn't sleep much. He sat in the chair with his coat on and the fire burning, and he thought about the Hayes family. He'd never met Robert Hayes directly. He'd seen him from a distance twice, once at the cattle auction in Millard Creek, once at the 4th of July gathering 3 summers ago. Big man, red-faced. The kind of man who talked loudly in rooms and expected the rooms to quiet for him. He'd heard Hayes called generous, and he'd heard him called ruthless, and he figured both things were probably true, depending on whether you had something he wanted. Margaret Hayes he knew only by reputation. A small, sharp woman who reportedly ran the household with a precision that made the ranch hands afraid of her. That family had sent their daughter out into a winter storm. He kept turning it over, looking for an angle where it made sense, and kept not finding one. Around 3 in the morning, he got up and added wood to the fire and stood for a moment looking at the closed door of the bedroom. The only other room in the cabin barely big enough for the iron bed frame and the side table. He could hear nothing from inside. Good. He went back to his chair and picked up the envelope he'd been trying to read before the storm. Gerald Hatch's latest letter about the lease terms, and tried again to concentrate on it. He couldn't. She was awake when first light came gray through the window. He heard the floorboards, the third plank from the wall always announced itself, and then she appeared in the bedroom doorway, wrapped in the blanket, her hair combed neatly, which he suspected had cost her considerable effort with whatever was in that travel bag. "Good morning," she said. "Morning." He was already at the small iron stove, which served double duty for heat and cooking, with a pan of cornmeal going. "Sit down." She sat at the table. The only table, a small square of rough pine with 2 mismatched chairs, and he put a bowl in front of her. She looked at it, then at him. "You've been up all night." "I don't need much sleep." "That's not what I asked." He sat down across from her. "I got some. Eat." She ate. He watched her, not in a way that was rude, just in the way of a man trying to read a situation he didn't fully understand yet. She ate the cornmeal without comment or complaint, which he noted. He'd known women who would have looked at that bowl with a kind of horror. She just ate it. "The storm's still going," he said. "Should break by afternoon. And then, depends on what you're doing." She set down the spoon. "I don't have anywhere to go." "The next town. My family is in the next town." Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it, something that had been compressed very tightly for a long time. "My father will be waiting. My fiancé will be with him, and they will take me back home, and I will be married within the month, whether I have agreed or not." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're sure that's the plan?" "Mr. Walker," she said, "I am the plan. I have been the plan for as long as I can remember. My marriage is a business arrangement between 2 powerful men, and I am the commodity being exchanged. I refused. My father decided I needed to be convinced." She paused. "I imagine he thought a night in a storm would do it." "That's a dangerous way to convince somebody." "Yes," she said. "It is." Something moved through the room that wasn't the wind or the fire. He looked at the table, then back at her. "What are you planning to do?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't know yet, but I'm not going back." You understand what that means for a woman out here, by herself. I understand perfectly. She picked up the spoon again. I was hoping, and I recognize this is an extraordinary thing to ask a stranger, that I might stay here, for a short while I work out what comes next. He didn't answer immediately. The cornmeal was warm, and the fire was good, and outside the storm was still pushing hard against the walls of the cabin. And here was this woman, this Hayes woman from the most prominent family in the territory, sitting in a chair in his $12 house asking to stay. "I have no money to offer you," she said. "At least not right now. There's a small account my grandmother's. They don't know about it. I can access it in Cheyenne, but I'm not asking for money," he said. She stopped. "I wasn't going to charge you," he said. "I was going to say there's nothing here. It's rough. I don't live fancy." I noticed. There are things that need doing on the property. Always things. If you're staying, you work. That's how it goes. She considered this. What kind of work? Whatever needs doing. You're not too proud. Something flickered in her eyes, something between amusement and relief. "Mr. Walker, I just walked a mile through a blizzard in the wrong shoes because I'd rather freeze than be sold to a man I despise. I am not too proud." He almost smiled. Almost. "All right," he said. "Then you can stay until you figure out what's next." The storm broke by early afternoon as he'd predicted. He went out to check the fences, and she came with him in his old coat, the spare one that was too big for her by a considerable degree, with her traveling shoes wrapped in burlap he'd given her because they were useless, and he had nothing else in her size. She looked completely impractical. She kept up with him without a word. The back fence had 2 posts down. He started working on the first one while she held the wire taut without being asked, without a lesson, just watching once and then doing it. And they worked in silence for a while, and then she said, "How long have you been here?" "On this property 4 years." "Where before?" He drove the post deeper with the mallet. "East of here. My family had land. Lost it." "I'm sorry. Long time ago." He moved to the second post. "What about you? You spent your whole life on the Hayes Ranch." "My whole life," she confirmed. "Every summer, every winter. I know every corner of that house. I know the sound it makes in a storm. I know where the larder key is kept, and how to make my father's favorite dinner, and which of the ranch hands I can trust, and which ones report to my father." A pause. "But I don't know what I want. Not yet. I was never asked." He looked at her. She was looking out at the white field, at the flat plain stretching under the gray sky, at the nothing that made up most of the Wyoming territory. "You know what I don't understand," he said. "Probably a great many things about me. Why now? If you've been planning to refuse, why wait until they've already arranged the marriage and hired the driver and all the rest of it?" She turned and looked at him. Her expression was very direct. "Because I didn't know until the moment my father told me to get in that wagon that I was capable of saying no." He turned that over. "What happened when you said it?" "He told the driver to leave. Just like that. Just like that." He went back to work on the fence. After a moment he said, "He'll come looking." "Yes. This is a small territory. I know. People talk. I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him with those very steady dark eyes and said, "Are you trying to talk me out of staying?" "No," he said. "I'm trying to make sure you know what staying costs." She held his gaze. "I've already paid the highest price, Mr. Walker. I paid it the moment I refused him. Everything after this is just living." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the fence. "It's Ethan," he said. And she said, "Ethan," and went back to holding the wire, and the snow around them was very white and very still. And somewhere under the quiet, the whole shape of the future sat waiting patient and unknowing, the way the future always does. The first week was hard, in the way that honest work is hard. She wasn't delicate. He'd expected delicate, expected the flinching and the hesitation, the constant need for things to be explained and then explained again. He'd expected to spend half his time running interference between a Hayes woman and a working ranch. What he got was someone who asked a question exactly once. She asked how to muck a stall. He showed her. She did it. When she did it wrong the second time, he corrected her, and she corrected herself, and that was the end of the lesson. She asked how to work the pump when it was frozen at the base. He showed her the trick of it, the specific angle the patience required. She remembered. She made mistakes. She wasn't afraid of the mistakes, which was the important part. On the fourth day, she came into the cabin at midday, with her coat dark with something, and her hands scraped raw, and he stood up from the table where he'd been working on the account books. What happened? One of the smaller caps, she said. It went through the thin ice on the north side. I got it out. He looked at her hands, looked at the coat. By yourself. It wasn't very big. She peeled off the coat. I think I may have pulled something in my shoulder, and I need to know where you keep the clean cloths. Second shelf. He crossed to the door and took the coat from her. Sit down. I'm fine. Your hands are bleeding. She looked at them with a kind of detached curiosity. So they are. I got the basin and the clean water and the cloth, and he cleaned the scrapes on her palms. The right one was worse, a long graze from wrist to the base of her fingers, and she sat still and didn't make a sound. You could have waited, he said. I was only on the west side. The calf wasn't waiting. He looked up at her. She was looking at her hand in his, watching what he was doing with a focused attention. And there was something in her face. Something that was concentration on the surface, and something older underneath. You're not what I expected, he said. She glanced at him. What did you expect? He thought about how to say it without making it sound like what it almost was, which was the word spoiled. I expected it to take longer, he finally said. She almost smiled. To become useful. To stop looking around at everything like it surprised you. A pause. It does surprise me, she said quietly. All of it. Every day. She looked at the window at the gray sky and the flat field and the tree line. I keep waiting to find it terrible. I keep waiting to want to go back. And every morning I wake up and I don't. He finished with her right hand and started on the left. Don't push the shoulder, he said. Let it rest tonight. It's fine, Charlotte. She looked at him, slightly startled, he thought, by the directness of her own name in his mouth. Let it rest tonight, he said again. A pause. And then reluctantly, all right. On the 8th day, a rider came to the gate. Ethan saw him from the field, the figure on horseback too well dressed for ranch work, sitting too straight in the saddle, the way people sit when they're conscious of being watched. He was maybe 30 yards out when Ethan recognized the horse. It was a gray thoroughbred. Expensive. The kind of horse bought to be seen. He walked toward the gate without hurrying. The rider waited. Up close he was a man about 40, broad-faced, ruddy from the cold, wearing a coat that cost more than Ethan made in 3 months. He had the look of a man who ran things not by doing them himself, but by expecting other people to. Walker, the man said. That's right. My name is Harrison Cole. I represent the Hayes family. Ethan didn't say anything. Cole shifted in the saddle slightly. I understand you've been hospitable to the Hayes daughter, Charlotte. I found a woman half frozen to death at my gate, Ethan said. What happened after that is just common decency. Of course. Cole's voice was smooth, practiced. Her family is concerned for her welfare. They'd like her to come home. You should probably ask her. A pause. She's here then. I didn't say that. Cole looked at him for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced an envelope and held it out over the gate. A gesture of gratitude, he said. For your trouble. Ethan looked at the envelope. He didn't take it. I don't need gratitude. Mr. Walker. Cole's voice dropped a degree. Less smooth now, more flat. This is a simple matter. A young woman from a good family found herself in an unfortunate situation. Her family wants to remedy that. There's no need to complicate things. You should probably ask her, Ethan said again. Not me. Cole stared at him. She's not your concern. She's a person who came to my property in need of help. That makes her my concern long enough to make sure she's all right. After that, he paused. After that, what she does is her own business, not mine. And not yours either, unless she says different. A long silence. Cole lowered the envelope. He looked at the property behind Ethan, the small cabin, the patched fence, the woodpile, the nothing of it all, with an expression that he didn't bother to hide. "You're a practical man," Cole said finally. "I hope you'll remain one." "I've never been anything else," Ethan said. Cole turned the horse and rode. Ethan came back to the cabin to find Charlotte standing in the doorway. She'd seen. She stepped back inside and he followed, and she stood with her arms crossed, not in anger, just in the way of someone bracing themselves. "What did he offer you?" she asked. "Didn't look in the envelope." She stared at him. "You didn't take it." "No, Ethan." She uncrossed her arms. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read entirely, some version of recognition in it. Something that looked like she was seeing a thing she hadn't expected to be real. "Do you know how much money my father has?" "I have a general idea. He can make things very difficult for you, for this property, for your lease." "I know." "Then why?" "Because you didn't ask me to send you back," he said simply. "So I didn't." She was quiet. The fire was low and the light in the cabin was gray and soft, and she was looking at him across the small room, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Then she said very quietly, "Nobody has ever just taken my side, before." He crossed to the fire and added a log. "I didn't do it to take a side," he said. "I did it because that's how a person's supposed to be treated. The rest of it." He set down the poker. "The rest of it's not complicated." She watched him for a moment longer. Then she nodded very small and went to get the water going for supper. Outside, the coal rider was already a dark shape disappearing down the main road, back toward the Hayes family and the arranged marriage and the life that Charlotte Hayes had walked a mile through a blizzard to escape. And inside a cabin, worth maybe $200, in the coldest corner of Wyoming. A cowboy who had $12 and a leaking roof and 4 years of ground he didn't own, stood beside the fire he'd built himself and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Like something was happening that he didn't want to stop. The second week began with a rumor. Ethan heard it from Tom Briggs, who ran the feed store at the edge of Millard Creek, and who had the particular talent of knowing everything about everyone, approximately 48 hours before it became official. Tom was the kind of man who wasn't malicious about it, he just couldn't help himself. Information flowed through him the way water flows through cracked ground. It didn't ask permission. Ethan had ridden in for feed and a replacement hinge for the barn door, and Tom had the hinge ready and the feed loaded before Ethan even had both feet on the ground, which meant Tom had been waiting for him. "Heard you had company out at the Walker place," Tom said. Ethan pulled his wallet out. "How much for the hinge?" 30 cents. Tom leaned on the counter. "Hayes girl, they're saying." "Who's they?" "Cole's man, the one Hayes sent out." Tom's voice dropped a degree not from secrecy, but from the particular pleasure of delivering news. "Word is, she refused to come back. Word is, you turned Cole away at the gate." "I told him to ask her himself," Ethan said. "He didn't want to do that." "No, I expect he didn't." Tom scratched the back of his neck. "Ethan, you know what you're sitting in the middle of, don't you? A slow Thursday. Don't do that. Robert Hayes is not a man who takes no for an answer. Not from his daughter, and sure as anything not from a ranch hand who leases 40 acres from Gerald Hatch." Tom's voice wasn't unkind. It was the voice of a man who had seen things go badly before and had developed a reflex around it. "He's going to push." "He can push," Ethan said, taking the hinge and his change. "Doesn't mean anything moves." I was almost to the door when Tom said, "The man she was supposed to marry, William Garrett. You know who that is?" Ethan paused. He knew the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. William Garrett owned the Silver Creek Ranch, which was the second largest operation in the territory after Hayes itself. He was 42 years old, twice widowed, and had a reputation that varied depending on who you asked and what they needed from him. "I know who he is," Ethan said. "Then you know he's not going to let this sit quiet either. It's not just about the girl." Tom lowered his voice to something approaching actual seriousness. "There's a land deal between Hayes and Garrett. Has been for 2 years. Charlotte was part of closing it. She backs out, the whole thing gets complicated. Ethan stood at the door for a moment, his hand on the frame. Thanks, Tom, he said. He rode back without hurrying, but he rode back thinking. I didn't tell Charlotte right away. He thought about it through the afternoon. While they worked, she was learning to use the small hand plow on the section of garden ground she'd decided entirely on her own initiative to expand before spring. And he watched her work and thought about land deals and what a woman was worth to two powerful men when she was a piece of a transaction. He hated that he was thinking about it that way. But he needed to understand the shape of what was coming. At supper, she said, "You're quiet." "I'm generally quiet." "You're quiet differently tonight." She set her fork down. "What happened in town?" He looked at her across the table. She had flour on her forearm from the bread she'd made that morning. She'd found flour in his stores and produced bread without mentioning it, which he'd come home to at noon and found cooling on the windowsill, and there was a smear of dark soil along her jaw from the garden work, and her hair was coming loose from its braid, and she looked, he thought, like a person who had been here a long time. She didn't look like she was visiting. "Tom Briggs told me about the land deal," he said. She went very still. "Between your father and Garrett," he said. "The one that involved you." A long moment passed. "He told you that?" "He was trying to warn me." "And are you warned?" Her voice was careful. Not cold, just careful. Like a person walking on ice they haven't fully mapped. "Tell me the rest of it," he said. "What I don't know yet." She looked at the table. She looked at the bread she'd made. Then she looked up and met his eyes. "The Hayes land runs along the north side of Silver Creek. Garrett's land runs along the south. Between them there's a strip about 600 acres that belongs to neither. It's disputed territory. There's been litigation for 3 years, and neither side has won outright. And if Garrett marries into the Hayes family, the litigation stops, because it becomes a family matter instead of a legal one. They divide the strip between them, and between them they own everything from the North Ridge to the river." Ethan sat back. 600 acres. At current prices, probably $40,000 of land. He looked at her. "I know," she said, and there was something in her voice that was exhausted and angry in equal measure. "I know exactly what I was. I was a way to stop a lawsuit. My father didn't see the problem with this. He thought he was doing something good for me, giving me a wealthy husband, a large house security." She stopped. "He thought the things he valued were the things I should value. And Garrett," her face changed, just slightly. "William Garrett is not a cruel man. He would have treated me well, probably. He's not someone who, he wouldn't have been unkind." She picked up her fork, then set it back down. "But he looked at me the way you look at a piece of land you're acquiring, assessing it, deciding how to use it. You told your father no. 3 times. The last time I put it in writing and sent it to his lawyer." She almost smiled, but it was a thin and brittle kind of smile. "I thought making it official might help." "What happened?" "He told me I was confused and emotional, and that I would understand when I was older, and then he arranged the trip, and then he told the driver to leave." She spread her hands flat on the table. "And then you found me." I was quiet for a moment. The fire was low, and the wind outside had calmed, and the cabin was very still. "You could fight it," he said, "legally. There are lawyers in Cheyenne who handle—" "I know." She cut him off, not rudely, just firmly. "I've thought about it. My grandmother's money might be enough to retain someone, but a lawsuit like this, a daughter against her father's arrangements without another man to stand behind her, it would take years. And in the meantime, I have to be somewhere. I have to be something." A pause. "I'm not afraid of the fight. I just need ground to stand on first." He thought about that. About ground. About what it meant to have it and not have it, and how long it took to get it back once you'd lost it. "You've got ground," he said. She looked at him. "Right here," he said. "Long as you need it." She looked at him for a long moment, and something moved across her face. Something that started as surprise and shifted into something quieter and deeper. Something she pressed back down before it fully surfaced. "You don't know what that could cost you," she said. I've thought about it. Ethan? Charlotte. He met her eyes. I'm not Gerald Hatch. I'm not Tom Briggs. I'm not anybody who's going to weigh you against what you're worth to somebody else. He paused. You're a person. You asked to stay. I said yes. That's where we are. The fire crackled. Outside, a horse shifted in the barn. She said very quietly, Why? He thought about it honestly. Because the first time I looked at you, you were half gone, and you still wouldn't break, he said. And I've met a lot of people in my life who break over a lot less. That means something. She looked down at her hands on the table. After a moment, she said, I don't know what to do with someone who... She stopped, started again. My father provides. My mother manages. Garrett would have owned. Nobody has ever just... She stopped again. Just what? Just asked what I needed, she said, and then given it. He didn't say anything to that. He stood up and cleared the bowls, and she sat at the table for another minute, still and quiet. And then she got up and helped him, and neither of them said anything more, and the evening went on around them, the way evenings do when something has shifted, but neither person is quite ready to name what it is. 3 days later, Charlotte Hayes proved she was not just surviving. She had taken the account books. He discovered this when he went to the shelf where he kept them 2 battered ledgers that Gerald Hatch's previous tenant had left behind, and which Ethan had repurposed for his own records, and found them missing. He found them on the table instead, open with a second sheet of paper beside them, covered in Charlotte's handwriting. Neat columns, clear numbers, notations in the margins. She was sitting with her back straight and her chin lifted with the particular energy of someone who has been waiting to say something and has finally decided to say it. You're being robbed, she said. He sat down. By who? By Gerald Hatch. She turned the account book toward him and put her finger on a column of figures. What is your lease rate? $40 a month. And what does Hatch's bill say your lease rate is? Ethan looked where she was pointing. He looked for several seconds. That's 47, he said. Yes. She moved her finger. He's been charging you a grazing fee separately from the lease rate. Look, it's here. It's listed as land maintenance. But there's no maintenance contract in your records. There never was. He's been adding $7 a month for 4 years. Ethan did the math. He didn't like the number it made. That's $336, Charlotte said. He hadn't needed to ask. Over 4 years, at $7 a month. She turned the paper toward him. I cross-referenced what you've paid against what you've received. You've been overpaying him since the first year. She paused. You didn't know. I didn't look closely enough. You were too busy working to look closely. She said it without judgment. I know how that happens. My father's foreman had the same thing done to him for 6 years before anyone noticed. She tapped the paper. You can confront Hatch. You have documentation. Or you can deduct it from future payments and write him a letter explaining the discrepancy. He sat back. He looked at the neat columns she'd made. He thought about 4 years of overpaying and what $336 would have meant. That was more than 1 year's lease free and clear. That was repairs to the roof and the fence both. That was possibly a start on buying the land outright. You went through all of this yourself, he said. I was up early. She folded her hands. I was good at numbers even before my mother hired me a tutor. She thought it was an unattractive quality in a young woman, but she let me continue because she didn't know how to stop me. A small pause. I'm not entirely useless out here. He looked at her. I never said you were. You thought I might be. For about the first hour, he admitted. She almost smiled, and it was different from the brittle one she'd given him before. This one had teeth in it. I'll take that as a significant improvement. He looked back at the account books. I'll write to Hatch this week. I already drafted the letter, she said. It's on the second page. I tried to make it firm without being inflammatory since you still need to maintain the lease. A beat. You can revise it however you like. It's your letter. He reached for the second page. The letter was perfect. Clear and documented and polite. The way a scalpel is polite, it went exactly where it was meant to go and no further. He looked up at her. "I've been watching my father conduct business my entire life," she said with the same matter-of-fact tone she'd used to explain she knew how to saddle a horse. "I just never had anyone to conduct it for." The letter went out on a Wednesday. On Friday, Gerald Hatch came to the property himself. He was a heavy-set man in his 60s, with a white mustache and the temper of someone who had been comfortable for long enough that discomfort felt like an insult. He rode to the cabin door and didn't dismount. "Walker," he said when Ethan came out. "Got your letter." "I expected you would." "You're accusing me of overcharging." "I'm documenting a discrepancy," Ethan said. 4 years of it. Hatch's face reddened. His eyes moved to the door of the cabin to Charlotte, who had come to stand in the doorway. He stared at her for a moment. "That's the Hayes girl," he said. "That's Miss Hayes," Ethan said. Hatch looked back at him. His expression shifted, recalculated. Ethan thought like a man resetting a trap. "Hayes' family's looking for her." "Lot of people looking for things," Ethan said. "Doesn't mean they find them." A pause. Something moved behind Hatch's eyes. "You know Robert Hayes knows where you live." "I expect so." "You know Gerald Hayes could have a word with your landlord." He stopped, corrected himself. "Robert Hayes." "I know you're my landlord," Ethan said. "And I know the letter I sent you is legally accurate. You can talk to whoever you like about whatever you like. But the discrepancy is documented, and I'll be deducting accordingly going forward." Hatch stared at him. "You're a brave man, Walker." "Just an honest one." Another long pause. Then Hatch looked at Charlotte in the doorway and said, "Your father sends his regards, Miss Hayes." Charlotte's chin lifted a degree. "Tell my father I'm well. He'd like you to come home." "I'm sure he would." Her voice was perfectly even. "Good day, Mr. Hatch." Hatch looked at them both for a moment, at the two of them standing outside the small cabin on the 40 acres of leased ground with the patched fence and the thin cattle, and his expression was the expression of a man who has not been dismissed very often and isn't sure how to handle it. Then he turned his horse and left. Charlotte waited until he was out of the gate. Then she exhaled slow and controlled. "He'll tell my father," she said. "Yes. That means they know I'm here, officially." "They probably already knew." Ethan looked at the road. "Now they know I know they know." She looked at him sidelong. "Is that a distinction that matters?" "Means nobody's pretending anymore," he said. "Sometimes that's easier." She considered this. "Or more dangerous." "Or both," he agreed. The town came for them on a Saturday. Not all of it. Not with torches or fury. It came the way towns usually do, in the form of women at the general store and men at the feed counter, and the particular silence that falls over a room when a specific person walks in. Ethan had needed to go in for supplies. Charlotte had come with him. He hadn't told her not to come. That wasn't a calculation he was willing to make to keep her out of sight, to hide her like something shameful. She was not shameful. So she came in her traveling coat that was holding up better than it had any right to, with her hair neat and her chin at its natural level. The general store had 5 people in it when they walked in. Mrs. Preston, who was the pastor's wife. Eleanor Marsh, who was the closest thing Millard Creek had to a schoolteacher. 2 men Ethan knew from the cattle exchange. And Dora Hines, who ran the post office counter from a desk in the back corner, and who was in terms of the local transmission of information even more efficient than Tom Briggs. Every single one of them looked up when the door opened. Mrs. Preston's face did something complicated. Eleanor Marsh looked at Charlotte with an expression that Ethan couldn't fully read. Curiosity possibly, or something approaching it. The 2 cattlemen looked at Ethan the way men look when they're trying to figure out whether to say something and deciding against it. And Dora Hines behind her desk simply watched. Ethan moved to the counter and gave his list to Frank, who ran the store and who had the great professional virtue of treating all transactions as transactions, regardless of the surrounding drama. Charlotte stood slightly behind him. Not hiding, just standing, letting the room be what it was. Mrs. Preston made her move first. "Miss Hayes," she said in the tone of a woman who has rehearsed what she's about to say and is committed to saying it. I hope you're well. Quite well, thank you, Mrs. Preston, Charlotte said. We've been concerned about your situation. That's kind. Your family has been asking after you. I know. Mrs. Preston's hands moved to clasp in front of her. It isn't quite appropriate, you understand, for a young woman to be Mrs. Preston. Charlotte's voice was pleasant, completely pleasant. Not sharp, not cutting, just utterly clear. I appreciate your concern. I am a grown woman who has made a considered decision about my own life. I'm not lost, and I'm not in need of rescue. Is there something else I can help you with? A silence. Mrs. Preston blinked. Then she looked at Ethan as if for confirmation of something, and Ethan looked back at her with a face that offered her nothing. No, Mrs. Preston said finally. No, I suppose not. Good day then, Charlotte said. Mrs. Preston collected herself and moved to the other side of the store, and from the post office corner, Dora Hines made a sound that might have been a quickly suppressed laugh. Frank put Ethan's supplies on the counter. Ethan paid. Charlotte took 2 of the bags before he could pick them up, and they left. On the steps in the cold, clear air outside, Charlotte walked beside him and said, I'm sorry if that made things harder. It didn't, he said. She'll talk. She was already talking. Now she'll talk about something slightly different. Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the way she looked at you. What about it? Like you were doing something wrong by letting me stay. She paused. Like you should have turned me away. I know how she looked. And he shifted the bag on his arm. People look at things the way they were taught to. Doesn't mean the teaching was right. She walked beside him to where Rye was hitched, and she stood while he loaded the supplies, and then she said very quietly, my whole life, every room I walked into, people looked at me a certain way because of my name, because of my family, because of what I was supposed to represent. She paused. I thought that when I left I'd escape it, but they still look at me, just differently now. You walked away from everything they think makes a person worth respecting, he said. They don't know what to do with that yet. Do you? He looked at her. Know what to do with it. Know what to do with someone who walked away from everything. He thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to expect from him. No, he said, but I know it took more courage than most people have, and I know what I see when I look at you. What do you see? A beat. He turned back to securing the bags on Rye. Someone worth looking at, he said, and he said it plainly the way he said most things without decoration. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she took Rye's reins and began leading him down the street toward the edge of town, and Ethan fell into step beside her, and the town of Millard Creek watched them go, with all the careful attention of a place that had already made up its mind and was only waiting to see if it was right. So, the twist came on a Tuesday. It came in the form of a letter. Not from Robert Hayes, not from William Garrett, from Gerald Hatch. Ethan read it standing at the door of the cabin with the morning cold at his back, and Charlotte waiting at the table behind him. He read it once, read it again. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket. What is it? She asked. He sat down at the table. He looked at her. He thought about how to say it straight, which was the only way he knew how to say things. Hatch is canceling the lease, he said. End of next month. The color didn't leave her face. She didn't make a sound. She just looked at him with those steady eyes and waited. He says there's a buyer for the property, Ethan said. Cash offer. He's within his rights. There's a 60-day cancellation clause in the agreement. I knew it was there when I signed. He paused. 60 days is just under 2 months. Who's the buyer? She asked. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the letter again and looked at the bottom. It doesn't say. She looked at him. He looked at her. My father, she said. It wasn't a question. I can't prove that. You don't need to prove it. She stood up and crossed to the window. He found the pressure point. He always finds the pressure point. She turned back. If he owns this land, you have nothing. If you have nothing, I have no place to be. And if I have no place to be... You go home, Ethan said. I go home. She said it quietly. And the marriage goes through and the land deal closes and everyone gets what they wanted except me. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. 4 years of work. $336 overpaid, and now the land itself yanked away. He thought about the account books. He thought about the north fence. He thought about the calf she'd pulled out of the ice. He thought about what she'd said that first morning. I've already paid the highest price. Everything after this is just living. Who owns the water rights on the south side? He asked. She frowned. What? South side of this property, the creek that runs along the bottom pasture. Who owns those water rights? She thought. I don't. It would be in the county land registry. Why? Because Hatch never filed a water claim when he bought the property. I found that out 2 years ago when I was looking at expansion options. It's one of the reasons the land is complicated to sell. Whoever buys it takes the land, but not necessarily the water. He looked up. If the water rights are still open, you could file a claim. Before the sale closes, if I file first and it holds, the land becomes significantly harder to flip, she said, her voice picking up. Because any buyer takes on a legal dispute with the water claim holder. She crossed back to the table. That's not enough to stop the sale entirely, but it buys time. And with time, I can get to the account in Cheyenne. She was thinking out loud now, her hands moving. My grandmother's money. It's not enough to buy the land outright, but it's enough to retain a lawyer. And if we can document that the purchase was made under duress, that it was specifically intended to coerce, can we document that? She stopped, looked at him. Hatch's visit. He said your father sends his regards within the same conversation where he delivered an implicit threat about your landlord speaking to Hayes. I heard it. You heard it. That's a connection, not proof. It's a start. She sat down. Her eyes were clear and sharp. Ethan, I need to go to Cheyenne. I know. I need to go soon. The account, the lawyer, it all has to move before the sale closes. How far is the account from the Hayes family's connections? She paused. My grandmother was my mother's mother. She didn't like my father very much. She set the account up specifically so he couldn't reach it. It's under her maiden name, Eliza Crandall. As far as I know, my father doesn't know it exists. He thought for a moment. I can ride to Cheyenne in 2 days. She said. He looked at her. I'm not sending you to manage my money on my behalf, she said firmly. We go. She met his eyes. Unless you're going to tell me it's too dangerous for a woman to ride to the territorial capital. I wouldn't say that to you, he said. I'd say it's 2 days through open country in winter. I walked a mile through a blizzard in the wrong shoes. I know. So, he looked at her for a moment. Then he stood up and reached for his coat. We leave Thursday morning, he said. We'll need to pack light. The road north is faster than the pass road this time of year. I'll be ready, she said. She already was. He could see that she was the kind of person who was always already ready, who had been spending her whole life waiting for someone to let her be. He just happened to be the one who finally did. They left Thursday before the sun was fully up. He put her on Rye. Rye was the more stable of the two horses, and the road north had patches that were unpredictable, and took the bay himself. The bay was younger and more difficult, but responded well if you were patient. Charlotte rode like someone who'd been on horseback her whole life, which of course she had, ranch girl, even a wealthy one. She settled Rye without fuss and adjusted the stirrups herself and didn't wait to be asked. They made good time the first day. The weather held cold, but clear, the sky a pale winter blue from horizon to horizon. They didn't talk much. The road didn't require much talk. Ethan watched the terrain the way he always did, and Charlotte watched it too with a focused attention that told him she was filing things away, learning the country. She did that with everything. At midday, they stopped by a creek to rest the horses. Charlotte handed him one of the biscuits she'd wrapped in cloth that morning without being asked to, and he ate it and thought about the water rights and the lease and the 60-day clock. What happens to your cattle? She asked. If I lose the lease? Yes. I'd have to move them. There's a man east of here, alderman, who might take them on shares while I sort out a new arrangement. Would you lose money on that? Some, not all. He drank from the canteen. It's not a disaster, it's a bad situation. He looked at the creek. 4 years of work doesn't just vanish because a land deal fails. The cattle are mine. The knowledge is mine. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you're not afraid. I'm plenty afraid, he said. I just don't let it make decisions for me. She looked at him with an expression. He was starting to recognize the one that appeared when he said something she was turning over slowly, holding it up to look at from different angles. My father uses fear, she said. He's very good at it. He makes you afraid of what will happen if you step outside the life he's arranged. Afraid of poverty. Afraid of judgment. Afraid of being alone. She paused. It worked on my mother. It worked on my brother. It worked on me for 27 years. And then it didn't. And then it didn't. She was quiet again. I woke up one morning and looked at William Garrett sitting across the breakfast table from my father, and I looked at his face, and I thought I would rather be cold and alone and poor than sit across a table from that man every morning for the rest of my life. She glanced at him. And then I became cold and alone and poor, and it turned out to be different from what I'd imagined. How so? She picked up Rye's reins and checked the bit something to do with her hands. It turned out there were worse things than being cold, she said, and better things than not being alone. He didn't answer that directly. He put the canteen away and stood up and said, We should make the way station before dark, if we move. Then let's move, she said, and swung up into the saddle like it was nothing, and they moved. They reached the way station, a rough traveler's stop halfway to Cheyenne, more barn than building just before the light went fully. There were 2 other travelers already there, a merchant heading south with a half-empty wagon, and a young man who said he was looking for work, and who looked at Charlotte in the firelight with an interest that was not quite impudent, but was not entirely polite either. Ethan didn't say anything about it. He just settled himself near her, and when the young man found that the angle didn't improve from that position, the interest faded. Charlotte, who had noticed all of it, said nothing until the young man was out of earshot. Then she said quietly, You didn't have to do that. Do what? She looked at him. Then she looked at the fire. Right, she said, and she let it rest. Later, when the merchant was asleep and the young man was outside with the horses, she sat with her back against the wall and said, When this is over. When which part is over? All of it. The lawyer, the lease, my father. She looked at her hands. When it's settled one way or another. What do you want? He thought about the question. He was not accustomed to being asked what he wanted. Land, he said. That's always been it. Land I own. Something I built that's actually mine. And after the land. I haven't thought much past the land. She looked at him. That's honest. I try to be. A pause. The fire shifted. Ethan? Her voice was quieter. I need you to know something. He waited. Whatever happens with my father, whatever deal gets made or unmade or fought over in a courthouse somewhere, I am not a piece of it. I'm not on the table. I'm not. She stopped. I'm not something to be negotiated. I know that, he said. I know you know it. She met his eyes. I just need you to still know it if things get harder. If he offers you something. If he threatens something. If there's a moment where it would be easier. Charlotte? She stopped. I turned down the envelope, he said. First day. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, I know. The fire burned low. The merchant snored gently. Outside, the wind had settled to a murmur. Get some sleep, he said. Long day tomorrow. She pulled her coat tighter. Ethan. Yeah. Thank you. And she said it in a way that was not about the water rights, or the lease, or the lawyer, or any of the practical things. She said it in the way of a person speaking about the whole sum of something. Every small decision that adds up to a life, every moment of being seen as a person instead of a plan. He didn't answer. But he didn't sleep for a while either, and the fire burned down to coals, and the way station was quiet, and somewhere between the darkness and the first pale light of Thursday becoming Friday. Something shifted, not between them, not yet, but around them. The way weather shifts before you can name it, the way the air changes before the storm arrives. The morning came cold and clear, and they rode toward Cheyenne. Cheyenne was nothing like Millard Creek. It was louder and faster, and full of the particular energy of a place that believed itself to be the center of something important, which in territorial terms it was. The streets were wide and the buildings were taller, and there were more people moving with more purpose than Ethan had seen in one place in years. He'd been here before twice for cattle business. Both times he'd been glad to leave. He was already glad to leave now, and they'd been here less than an hour. Charlotte moved through it differently. Not with comfort exactly, she wasn't comfortable. He could see that in the way she held herself, the way her eyes moved, but with a kind of focused efficiency that said she'd been in places like this before and knew how to operate in them. She led him directly to a bank on the second cross street without hesitating, which meant she'd known exactly where it was. "You've been here before," he said. "Once, with my grandmother, 4 years ago." She pushed through the door. She showed me where it was on purpose. She said a woman should always know where her money is. He followed her in. The banker was a thin man named Mr. Aldrich, who looked at Charlotte with the particular expression of a man who was trying to determine something and hadn't yet. She gave the account name, Eliza Crandall, and the corresponding number which she had memorized, and Aldrich went to the back and came out 10 minutes later with a ledger and a set of papers. "Miss Crandall's account," he said, and then paused. "You are her granddaughter, Charlotte Hayes. She appointed me as secondary holder 3 years before her death." Charlotte placed a folded document on the counter. "The authorization is here." Aldrich examined it, looked at her, looked at Ethan, who was standing 3 feet back with his hat in his hands, and then looked back at Charlotte. "The balance," he said carefully, "is somewhat higher than you may expect." Charlotte didn't blink. "How much higher?" Aldrich leaned in slightly and said a number. Ethan watched Charlotte's face. She absorbed it without flinching, which meant it was either what she'd anticipated or she had very good control of herself. Probably both. "My grandmother was more careful than anyone knew," she said. "She was a very deliberate woman." Aldrich agreed. He seemed to relax slightly. "How can we help you today, Miss Hayes?" "I need to withdraw enough to retain a lawyer," she said. "And I need a referral to the best one in Cheyenne who handles property and family law. Someone who is not connected to Robert Hayes in any professional capacity." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific requirement." "I'm aware." Another pause. Then he said, "There's a man named Harlan Voss. He's on the 3rd Street West. He handled the territory's water litigation last spring and won." He hesitated. "He's not cheap." "He doesn't need to be cheap," Charlotte said. "He needs to be good." Harlan Voss was a compact man in his 50s with a gray beard, trimmed close, and the eyes of someone who had read too many contracts in bad light. His office smelled like paper and lamp oil. He shook Charlotte's hand the way he would shake any client's hand, which Ethan noted because not every man did, and he gestured them to the chairs across from his desk. Charlotte laid it out. All of it. The arranged marriage, the land deal, the driver, the storm, Gerald Hatch's lease cancellation, and the implied connection to her father, the water rights. She spoke for 12 minutes without stopping clearly and in sequence, and when she finished, she put the account book copy she'd made on his desk. Voss looked at it. Then he looked at her. "You put this together yourself." "The financial discrepancy, yes. My father has lawyers who are better at this than I am." "Not necessarily." He picked up the account book copy and read it. Set it down. "The water rights claim is the first move. If Walker files in the county register before the sale closes, it creates a legal encumbrance on the property that any buyer takes on." He looked at Ethan. "How long to file?" "I don't know the process," Ethan said. 3 days for standard processing. 1 if you pay the expedited fee." Voss tapped the desk. "Do it today. Take the afternoon stage to the county recorder's office. I'll give you a letter." He turned back to Charlotte. For your situation, the coercion argument is possible, but it requires proof of intent. The driver is the key. Do you know his name? John Pratt. He works for the Hayes stable. If he can be deposed, if he'll talk his testimony about his instructions, is your strongest evidence. Voss leaned back. Your father will say you went willingly. He'll say you changed your mind, and the driver made a reasonable decision. You need Pratt's account of what he was told and by whom. Pratt was loyal to my father for 15 years, Charlotte said. Loyal men talk when the alternative is being charged as an accessory to reckless endangerment. Voss's voice was flat and practical. A young woman left in a blizzard. If she had died, the charge is not small. I expect Pratt knows that. Charlotte was very still for a moment. You think he'd testify? I think he'd rather testify than go to prison. Voss folded his hands. Here's what we do. Walker files the water claim today. I send a letter to Robert Hayes formal from my office, informing him that his daughter is represented by counsel and that any further interference with her place of residence or her legal affairs will be answered in court. That puts him on notice. He paused. It won't stop him, but it changes the cost. And the lease? Ethan asked. If the sale is designed to coerce, and we can demonstrate that the lease cancellation could be challenged as bad faith, Hatch would have to prove the buyer was independent. Given what you've described, Voss tilted his head. It's not certain, but it's not nothing. Ethan looked at the man for a moment. What's your honest assessment? Voss looked back at him. Honest Robert Hayes has more money and more connections than most of the courts in this territory have seen. He will fight this. It will cost more than one withdrawal, and it will take longer than you want it to. He paused. But you have something he doesn't expect. What's that? Charlotte asked. Documentation. Voss picked up the account book copy again. He expected her to arrive home frightened and without resources. Instead, she spent 2 weeks on a working ranch, identified a financial fraud, and showed up in my office with a paper trail. He almost smiled. He underestimated her. Men like your father usually underestimate what happens when a woman decides to stop being manageable. Charlotte looked at the desk. Then she looked at Voss. What do I sign first? They were in Cheyenne for 2 days. Ethan filed the water rights claim the afternoon of the first day, with a letter from Voss and a $15 expedited fee that Charlotte paid from her account without hesitation. The county recorder, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Folsom, who looked like she had processed 10,000 claims in her life and found them all equally interesting, took the paperwork and stamped it and gave him a receipt. How long is the claim valid? Ethan asked. Indefinitely once registered, Mrs. Folsom said, unless challenged in court, and even then it stays on the books while litigation is pending. She looked at the receipt. Water rights on the 40-acre Walker lease, filed as of today. She handed it to him. Good luck, Mr. Walker. He didn't ask how she knew he'd need it. On the second day, while Voss's office prepared the formal letter to Robert Hayes, Charlotte and Ethan walked through Cheyenne in the thin winter sunlight, and she said something that had been sitting in the air between them since the way station. I've been thinking about what happens after this, she said. After the lawyer letter. After all of it. After whatever my father does next. After the lease. She stopped at the edge of the boardwalk. I've been thinking about the ranch. He waited. 40 acres isn't enough, she said. Not with the cattle you have and what you're trying to build. You know that. She looked at him directly. My grandmother's money, there's more than enough to buy land. Real land. Not from Hatch. Not leased. Owned. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not taking your money, Charlotte. I'm not offering it as a gift. Her voice was steady. I'm talking about a business arrangement. A legitimate one. You have the knowledge and the labor and the stock. I have the capital. Together. Together it looks like a transaction, he said. To the town, to your father, to everybody. It makes it look like what you did was a calculation, not a choice. She stared at him. Do you care what it looks like? No, he said. I care what it is, and I'm not starting something on money I didn't earn. A pause. That's pride talking. Probably, he agreed. doesn't make it wrong. She stood looking at him for a long moment, and he could see her working through it, the frustration of practicality hitting the wall of his stubbornness. And then she said, "All right, not a gift, not a transaction." She folded her arms against the cold. "What would you call it?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'll know it when it's right." Something in her face shifted. Not satisfaction exactly. Something quieter. "That's the most aggravating answer I've ever received," she said. "You've met my fence posts," he said. "They don't move easy either." She looked at him for a moment. Then she made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, short and real, and completely unguarded. He'd heard her make sounds close to it before, but not that. Not that open. He looked at the street ahead so she wouldn't see that he was smiling. They arrived back in Millard Creek on a Friday. The town knew they'd been gone. The town knew they'd been gone together. Ethan had understood this would happen and had considered what to do about it for approximately 30 seconds before deciding he couldn't manage what people thought and wouldn't try. Charlotte had reached the same conclusion independently, which he found he wasn't surprised by. What he was surprised by was William Garrett. Garrett was at the property when they rode in. Not at the gate, inside the gate. Sitting on a horse in the yard in front of the cabin, accompanied by 2 ranch hands, who sat their horses with the particular posture of men who were there to be present and large, rather than useful. Ethan rode in without slowing. He came to a stop 10 feet from Garrett and looked at him. William Garrett was a large man, not fat, just big-built, heavy through the shoulders, with a square face and graying hair at the temples. He wore good clothes. He sat a horse the way people who have always had good horses sit them. He wasn't ugly, and he wasn't stupid, and he looked at Ethan the way Ethan imagined he looked at most things, like he was assessing the cost of acquiring it. "Walker," he said. "Garrett." Garrett's eyes moved to Charlotte. He looked at her differently, not with the acquisitive assessment of someone pricing a purchase, but with something that was more complicated than that. Almost like recognition. Like a man seeing something he'd expected to find broken and finding it wasn't. "Charlotte," he said. "William." Her voice was neutral, not hostile, just level. "Your father asked me to come. I expected he would." She dismounted without help. "You're welcome to speak, then you'll go." Garrett's jaw tightened slightly. He dismounted too slowly with the deliberateness of a man who wants to be seen not hurrying. "I'd prefer to speak privately." "Everything you have to say to me," she said, "you can say in front of Ethan Walker. He knows my situation." A pause. Garrett looked at Ethan, then back at Charlotte. "You know this isn't what I wanted. Sending you as my father's messenger. No, I imagine not." "Any of it." His voice dropped. The ranch hands were far enough back that he could say something real, and Garrett, to his credit, appeared to want to. "The arrangement, the way it was handled. I told your father a month ago that I wasn't comfortable with how it was moving forward." Charlotte went very still. "What does that mean?" "It means I knew he was pressuring you." Garrett met her eyes. "I didn't know about the driver. I didn't know what happened in the storm." Something moved across his face, something that looked, Ethan thought, genuinely like remorse. "When I heard, I told him that was too far." "You told him," she said. "And then you came here. He's not a man you tell easily." Garrett's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, the particular sound of a man who has made his share of calculations and isn't proud of all of them. "The land deal is real. The financial stakes are real. But Charlotte..." He stopped. "I'm not here to take you back. I'm here to ask if there's a way to end this without it becoming a war." Ethan stayed very still on his horse and said nothing. Charlotte looked at Garrett for a long moment. "What does that mean practically?" she asked. "It means if there's a settlement, if your father can save face, if the land situation can be resolved some other way, he might let this go." Garrett paused. "I might let this go." "The deal." "The deal. Yes." "And what do you want in return?" Garrett looked at her. "Nothing from you," he said. And he said it with a directness that surprised everyone present, including possibly himself. I want out of your father's arrangement as cleanly as I can get. The land dispute I'll settle through lawyers. He glanced at Ethan. I already know about Voss. Ethan said nothing. He sent your father a letter this morning, Garrett said. Robert read it 3 times, then he called me. He looked back at Charlotte. He's angrier than I've seen him, but he's also scared. That letter. A pause. Your lawyer knows what he's doing. Charlotte said nothing for a moment. Then, and Hatch, the lease. Garrett was quiet. Hatch's buyer, he said carefully, is a holding company. I am one of the parties in that company. I didn't know it was Walker's lease specifically. I knew it was property near the Hayes border. The silence that followed was very loud. Ethan looked at him. So you're the buyer? Partially. Garrett met his eyes without flinching. I didn't know you were the tenant when it was arranged. I found out this morning. And now that you know, Garrett looked at Charlotte, then back at Ethan. Something in his face settled the settlement of a man making a decision. He'd been circling for a while. I'm not in the habit of being used as a weapon, he said. I'm in the habit of making money. Those 2 things came into conflict and I don't like it. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. Ethan leaned from his horse and took it. It was a withdrawal notice from the property purchase. Signed by Garrett. Dated today. Ethan looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at Garrett. That's not a favor, Garrett said. That's me making a business decision that doesn't require me to ruin a man who did nothing except help a woman in a storm. He settled his hat. Your lawyer's water rights claim would have complicated the purchase anyway. I know, Ethan said. Good. Garrett turned to Charlotte. I'm not your enemy. I was never your enemy. I was a man who thought a transaction was simpler than it was. He paused. I'm sorry for my part in it. Charlotte looked at him. Looked at him with those steady dark eyes that had been looking at everything clearly since the moment she'd thawed out enough to see. Tell my father, she said slowly, that I am well. Tell him that I am not coming home. And tell him that if he sends anyone else to this property, anyone at all, the next letter from Mr. Voss will not be a notification. It will be a lawsuit. Garrett nodded once. I'll tell him. He mounted his horse, looked at Ethan one more time. You should buy that land, he said, before someone else does. And he rode out. They stood in the yard and watched him go. After a moment, Ethan dismounted. He stood holding Rye's reins and looking at the withdrawal notice in his hand. He came on his own, Charlotte said quietly. I think so. My father didn't send him here to do that. No. She was quiet for a moment. My father is going to be furious. Yes. This isn't over. No, he said. But we just got some time. He folded the notice and put it in his coat beside the water rights receipt. 2 documents. 2 pieces of ground. It wasn't much, and it wasn't nothing. Ethan. He looked at her. Are you all right? He thought about the question. About 4 years and a leaking roof and the account books and the $12 and the $336 and the fence posts. Yeah, he said. I'm all right. She studied him. You're not going to say it. Say what? That this changes things. That we actually have a chance. She crossed her arms. You're not going to say it because you don't believe in saying things until they're real. That's accurate. I know it's accurate. It's also irritating. But her voice held something underneath the irritation, something warmer than irritation, something that lived in the same neighborhood. We have a better position than we had this morning, he said. That's real. That's real, she agreed. She let out a slow breath. What do we do now? Feed the horses, he said. Then look at the water rights receipt and figure out what Voss needs next. She stared at him. That's your answer. It's the next thing, he said. That's all I know how to do. The next thing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she took Rye's reins from him smoothly without fuss and started toward the barn. Then let's do the next thing, she said over her shoulder. He followed her. Robert Hayes arrived himself on the following Tuesday. There was no advance warning. No letter. No messenger. He simply rode up the road in the middle of the afternoon with 3 men behind him and stopped at the gate and called Ethan's name in the voice of a man who expected the sound of his own name to produce results. Ethan came out of the barn. He'd heard the horses. He'd had maybe 40 seconds to decide how to stand, and he'd decided to stand the way he always stood, straight, unhurried, without his hat in his hands. Robert Hayes was exactly as he'd appeared from a distance 2 years ago. Big, red-faced, the kind of man who filled a room without trying because he'd spent his whole life being given room. He was 60 or close to it, with gray in his hair and the build of someone who'd worked hard in his youth and kept the size but lost the habit. His coat was excellent. His boots were excellent. His horse was excellent. Everything about him announced that he was a man of consequence. He looked at Ethan the way he probably looked at most men, briefly, assessingly, and with the settled conclusion that the assessment hadn't found much. "Walker," he said. Not a greeting, a label. "Mr. Hayes." "Where is she?" "Not available." Hayes's eyes narrowed. "She's my daughter." "She's a grown woman," Ethan said. "Those are different facts. Don't be clever with me, son." Hayes's voice dropped, the particular drop of a man turning a dial toward threat. "You are sitting on borrowed land with borrowed time, and you have made a considerable mistake in involving yourself in my family's affairs." "Your family's affairs walked up to my fence post half frozen," Ethan said. "I didn't go looking for it." One of the men behind Hayes shifted in his saddle. Hayes raised one hand slightly, a small gesture barely visible, and the man went still. It was the gesture of a man who had made many such gestures, who had spent decades making small gestures that produced large compliance. "I'll be direct," Hayes said. "Please. I have the resources to make your situation here very difficult. The lease situation with Hatch is not the only pressure point. There's the cattle operation. I have relationships with the buyers in this county. There's your credit with the bank. There's the question of references when you seek new land." He paused. "I'm not threatening you, Walker. I'm describing reality." "I understand the description," Ethan said. "Then you understand that protecting my daughter at the expense of everything you've built is not rational." "Maybe not," Ethan said. "But I told her she had a place here, and I keep my word. Whether that's rational is a separate question." Hayes stared at him for a moment. "What does she have here?" His voice shifted, and for just a moment, underneath the authority and the threat and the decades of consequence, there was something that was almost a real question. "What does this?" He gestured at the cabin, the patched fence, the modest property. "What does any of this give her?" Ethan looked at the man. He looked at the genuine incomprehension in Robert Hayes's face, the sincere inability to understand what a woman who had grown up with everything could possibly want with nothing. "Ask her," he said. "If you genuinely want to know, ask her yourself." A pause. "She won't see me," Hayes said, quieter. "You sent a man to leave her in a blizzard," Ethan said. "You might need to begin with that." Hayes was very still. The 3 men behind him were very still. The wind moved through the yard, and the cattle moved in the field, and somewhere in the cabin, Ethan knew Charlotte was standing just back from the window, listening to every word. "I thought—" Hayes stopped, started again. "I believed she was being foolish. Young women are sometimes—" "She wasn't foolish," Ethan said. "She was clear. She told you no, 3 times from what I understand, in writing." He paused. "You just didn't believe she meant it." Hayes's jaw worked. "She has obligations." "To herself," Ethan said. "Same as anybody." The silence stretched. Hayes looked at the cabin. Looked at it for a long moment, not at Ethan, just at the building, at the window, at whatever he could or couldn't see behind it. Then the door opened. Charlotte came out. She walked to Ethan's side, and she stood there, not behind him, beside him, and she looked at her father. Robert Hayes looked at his daughter, and something passed across his face that Ethan would not have predicted. Not anger, not triumph. Something that was tired. Something that was old in a way the rest of him tried not to be. "Charlotte," he said. "Father." Her voice was level but not cold, just steady. the steadiness of someone who had already had this conversation in their head many times. "You look—" He stopped. "You look well." "I am well." "Come home." "No." A pause. "This is not appropriate." "I know you believe that." She met his eyes. "I've thought about it very carefully. I'm still here." "Garrett. William Garrett and I spoke. He's withdrawing from the land arrangement. The dispute between your properties will go through lawyers. That's appropriate." She paused. "I'm not a solution to your legal problems." Hayes looked at her for a long moment. His face went through several things. "I did not mean for you to be harmed," he said finally. "In the storm. I thought the driver was supposed to— I was supposed to leave me there, Father. Whatever you told yourself his instructions were." She said it without cruelty and without heat. "I could have died. I didn't. That's not because of anything you planned." Hayes's hands tightened on the reins. "I have responsibilities to this family, and I am your family," she said. "Not a piece of it. Me. And you sent me into a blizzard because I disagreed with you." Her voice stayed level. "I need you to sit with that. I need you to actually sit with it." He looked at her. And this time what was in his face was not authority or threat or consequence. It was something smaller and older. A man seeing something he'd broken and beginning to understand the size of what he'd done. "What do you want?" he said. Not Hayes the patriarch. Just a man asking his daughter a question. She took a breath. "I want to be left alone. For now. I want the lease situation with Hatch resolved, genuinely resolved without pressure. I want to sort out my life without interference." She paused. "And eventually, when you've thought about what happened, I would like to speak with you. As equals. Not as father and child, not as head of household and dependent. As two people." Hayes was quiet for a long time. "You sound like your grandmother," he said finally. "I take that as a considerable compliment." Something moved across his face. It might have been grief. It might have been the beginning of understanding. It was hard to say which, and possibly it was both. "The lease," he said. His voice had changed, stripped of the authority, just tired. "I'll speak with Hatch." Charlotte nodded once. "Thank you." Hayes looked at Ethan. The assessment was different now, less dismissal, more consideration. "You kept her safe," he said. "She kept herself safe," Ethan said. "I just opened the door." Hayes looked at him for another moment. Then he turned his horse. He rode out without another word. The three men followed, and Charlotte and Ethan stood in the yard in the cold and watched the road until the sound of the horses faded into nothing, and there was only the wind and the cattle and the thin winter light on the 40 acres they hadn't yet lost. Charlotte let out a long breath. "He'll think about it," she said. "Whether he changes or not, I don't know. But he'll think about it." "That's something," Ethan said. "It's something." She turned to look at the cabin. "It's not over." "No. My father doesn't change quickly. And there are still things he controls that can hurt you." "I know." She looked at him. "You're still not afraid." He considered that honestly. "I'm more afraid than I was," he said. Standing in front of him, knowing how much he could take. Yeah, that was something. He looked at the road. "But fear of him and fear for you are different things." She turned to look at him fully. "Fear for me. If he'd tried to take you," Ethan said simply. "If he'd brought men and tried to make you go. I don't have much, but I'd have put everything in between." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was very open, very clear, the way things are when the pretense has been used up, and there's only the truth left in the room. "Ethan," she said. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't say it yet." He looked at her steadily. "Say it when things are settled. Say it when you've had time, and you know what you're choosing. Not in the middle of it with your father's horse still on the road." She looked at him. Understood. And nodded once, the nod of someone respecting a position even while disagreeing with the timeline. "All right," she said. She went inside. He stood in the yard, another minute, looking at the road. His water rights receipt was registered against feeling the weight of everything they'd done and everything still in front of them. Then he went to finish the fence. Because that was always the next thing. And because some things you build before you know what you're building them for. Hatch sent a letter 3 days after Robert Hayes rode out. It was short. 3 sentences. The lease cancellation was being withdrawn. The property sale was no longer proceeding. All outstanding discrepancies in billing would be credited against future payments. Ethan read it twice. Then he put it on the table next to the water rights receipt and the Garrett withdrawal notice and looked at the 3 documents together. Charlotte read it over his shoulder. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He moved faster than I expected. Your father doesn't do things slowly when he decides to do them." "No." She straightened. "He's not done, you know. This is him taking a step back, not surrendering." "I know. He'll find another angle." "Probably." Ethan folded the letter and added it to the others. "But right now the lease is safe and the water rights are filed, and we have a lawyer who knows the full picture." He looked at her. "That's more ground than we had a month ago." She looked at the stack of documents. Something in her face was working through something, not relief exactly, more like a woman recalibrating, updating her map of the territory. "What do you need done today?" she asked. He almost smiled. "North fence. 2 posts still soft from the thaw." "I'll get the mallet," she said. The town shifted. It was gradual, the way most things shift in small places, not with a dramatic announcement, but through accumulation. One conversation. One person who changed their mind and then talked to someone who talked to someone else. It started with Eleanor Marsh. The school teacher came to the property on a Wednesday morning with a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth and the careful expression of someone who had decided to do something and was going to do it regardless of how it was received. Ethan saw her coming up the road and went to the gate. "Miss Marsh." "Mr. Walker." She held out the bread. "I wanted to call on Miss Hayes." He took the bread. "I'll let her know. I'd like to tell her myself if that's all right." Eleanor Marsh had the precise voice of a woman who had spent 20 years managing rooms full of unruly children and had emerged from it with excellent diction and a spine like iron. "I said some things in the general store after she came in with you. Things I said to Mrs. Preston." She paused. "They weren't kind. I'd like to apologize in person." Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the gate. Charlotte came out of the cabin when she heard voices. She stopped when she saw Eleanor Marsh, and something in her face went careful, not cold, just careful. She'd learned to be careful with the town. "Miss Hayes," Eleanor said, "I owe you an apology." Charlotte waited. "What I said to Mrs. Preston about the impropriety of your situation, I repeated it where it could be heard, and I was wrong." She stood straight and said it plainly without decorating it. "Not about the propriety argument necessarily, about the judgment. A woman makes a decision about her own life, and I joined the people who made it harder. That wasn't right." Charlotte looked at her for a moment. "What changed your mind?" Eleanor was quiet. "I heard about what happened with your father, about what actually happened, the driver, the storm." She met Charlotte's eyes. "My mother was widowed when I was 8. She had 3 children and no money and no property in her name and no one who was required to help her. She made it work anyway. It took everything she had." A pause. "I looked at your situation and I decided it was scandalous. Then I looked at it again and I decided it was brave. Those 2 things can coexist, I think. But I should have started with the second one." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come in, I'll make coffee." Eleanor Marsh was not the last. Tom Briggs stopped performing elaborate pantomimes of not having heard anything about Ethan's situation and simply started treating him normally, which for Tom meant an unusual level of information flow. He let it be known in the precise and efficient way he let things be known that Ethan Walker had done right by a woman in trouble and that anyone saying different could bring their feed business somewhere else. Tom Briggs's opinions on most subjects were moderate. His opinions on his feed business were absolute. Dora Hines at the post office began holding Ethan's mail aside separately, which was her way of showing respect. She also told him one Thursday, when he came in for a letter from Voss, that 3 men had come through the post office in the past week asking about Charlotte Hayes. "What kind of men?" he asked. "Quiet kind." She handed him the letter. "Not sheriff's men, not lawyers. The kind your father-in-law sends when he wants to know something without being seen asking." Ethan took the letter. "She's not my—" "I know what she is and isn't," Dora said pleasantly. "I'm telling you what your enemies will assume, which is the same thing as telling you what to watch for." He thanked her and left and read the letter from Voss on his horse. The letter was detailed and not entirely comfortable. John Pratt, the driver who had left Charlotte in the storm, had been located in a town 40 miles south. Voss's associate had spoken to him. Pratt was willing to make a statement. He was willing to describe exactly what instructions he had received from whom and in what terms. The instructions had come from Robert Hayes directly, in writing. Ethan read that line 3 times. In writing meant Pratt had documentation. In writing meant this was not a matter of one man's word against a wealthy family's. In writing meant the coercion case that Voss had called possible was now considerably more than possible. He rode back to the cabin at a pace Rye found uncharacteristically urgent. Charlotte read the letter at the table. She read it the way she read everything completely without rushing, her face composed. When she finished, she set it down, and her hands were very still on the paper. "He wrote it down," she said. "Yes. My father wrote down instructions to leave me." She said it without inflection, not a question. Just a person making something real by saying it out loud. Voss thinks with Pratt's statement and the written instructions, the coercion case is strong enough to file, Ethan said. Not just as leverage, an actual case. She looked at the letter. That would be public. Yes. It would go through the courts. It would be in the record. She looked up. My father's name. What he did. Yes. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Ethan sat down across from her and waited, because this was not a moment for pushing. He'll fight it, she said. Voss expects that. It'll be expensive and long and ugly, and the newspapers will pick it up eventually because it's the Hayes name, and they always pick up the Hayes name. She looked at the table. And at the end of it, whatever the result he'll be a man who wrote down instructions to abandon his daughter in a blizzard. That'll be the thing people know. Yes, Ethan said. That's what it'll be. She looked up. Her eyes were clear and steady, but there was something in them that was also just a daughter, just a 27-year-old woman whose father had done something that couldn't be undone and who was now holding the document that proved it. What do you think I should do? She asked. He looked at her. I think you should do what's right for you. Not what punishes him and not what protects him. What's right for you. Those might be the same thing. They might be. She looked at the letter one more time. Then she folded it carefully and stood up. I need to think, she said. Take the time. She went to the door, pulled her coat from the hook. I'm going to walk the north pasture. Cold out. I know. She looked at him for a second from the doorway. Thank you. For what? For not telling me what to decide. She went out. He sat at the table and looked at the window and thought about Robert Hayes writing instructions on paper and about what kind of man does that not. In anger, not in a moment, but deliberately in writing, because he was so certain of his own authority that it didn't occur to him the paper could ever be used against him. The certainty of men like that was its own kind of blindness. She came back an hour later with color in her face from the cold and said, I'm going to write to him first. Ethan looked up from the account book. Before I file anything, before Voss does anything else. She hung up the coat. I'm going to write him a letter. Tell him what I know. Tell him what Pratt said. Tell him what the documentation shows. She sat down. And I'm going to give him a choice. What choice? He releases any claim on my independence formally legally through Voss. He leaves this property and this lease alone permanently. He acknowledges that the land dispute with Garrett's property is a legal matter and removes my name from any arrangements connected to it. She paused. In return, I don't file. The deposition stays with Voss and doesn't go to a court. Ethan thought about it. He could refuse. He could. And then I file, she said simply. But I want to give him the opportunity to be better than what he did. Not for his sake. She looked at Ethan steadily. For mine. I don't want to go to war with my father if there's another way. Not because I'm afraid of it. Because I'd rather build something than spend the next 2 years destroying something. He looked at her for a long moment. That's not weakness. I know it isn't. Some people will call it that. Some people can mind their own fences. She pulled paper toward her and picked up the pen. I'm going to write it now, while I know exactly what I want to say. He got up and moved to the other end of the cabin and let her write. She wrote for 40 minutes. When she finished, she read it back once, made 2 corrections, and folded it. Will you read it? She asked. He came back to the table. She handed it to him, and he read it. It was the best letter he'd ever read. Not because it was eloquent, though it was, but because it was precise in a way that made precision feel like mercy. Every fact named. Every consequence stated. Every offer framed not as a threat, but as a door. A door Robert Hayes had not deserved to have opened for him and was being given anyway. He handed it back. Well, she said. Send it, he said. The letter went out on a Thursday. The response came on a Monday. Not a letter. Robert Hayes himself again. But this time alone. No men behind him. Just one horse and one man riding up the road and stopping at the gate and not calling anyone's name. Ethan saw him from the barn. He came out and walked to the gate slowly, and Hayes was sitting his horse with a stillness that was different from the last time. The stillness of a man who has been sitting with something heavy and has not yet put it down. I'd like to speak with Charlotte, Hayes said. His voice was different too. Not stripped of authority exactly, but wearing it differently, the way a man wears clothes that don't quite fit anymore. I'll ask her, Ethan said. He went inside. Charlotte was at the table with the account books. She had taken over managing them entirely by now, and had found 3 additional discrepancies that Hatch had quietly not mentioned in his settlement letter. She looked up when Ethan came in. Your father, he said. Alone, at the gate. She set down the pen. She didn't move for a moment, just sat with it. Then she stood and straightened her collar and went out. Ethan stayed inside. He stood at the window, not to watch, just to be close, and the light through the glass was thin and cold, and he could see the shapes of them at the gate, but couldn't hear the words. They talked for a long time, longer than he'd expected. He made coffee and set a cup on the table for her and stared at the account books without seeing them, and waited. When she came back in, she sat down in the chair and didn't say anything for a full minute. He signed it, she said. Ethan looked at her. The agreement, Voss's terms. He had his lawyer draw it up. I suppose he knew what I was going to ask before I asked it, or something close to it. She looked at her hands. Full release of any claim on my choices. No interference with the lease. His name removed from the Garrett land arrangement. All of it. He signed it today. He brought it with him. She looked up. He rode out here alone to give it to me himself. He waited. He said... She stopped. Started again. He said he'd been wrong. Not everything he didn't say, everything was wrong. He said the storm was wrong. Leaving me in the storm. She pressed her hands flat on the table. He said he'd been telling himself the driver was supposed to take me to town. That it was a scare, not a danger. That he'd miscalculated. She stopped. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if he's telling me what he actually believed or what he needs to believe now. Does it matter? She thought about it. I don't know yet. She looked at the window. He asked me if I was happy here. What did you say? Something moved across her face, something very quiet and very certain. I said yes, she said. I said yes without having to think about it. She looked at Ethan. That surprised me. How fast it came. He looked at the coffee cup, looked at the account books, looked at the water rights receipt still in his coat pocket. He asked about you, she said. He looked up. What about me? He asked what you were to me. She met his eyes. I told him you were someone who kept his word. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that was rarer than it should be. She paused. I think that was the closest thing to respect he knows how to offer someone like you. I'll take it, Ethan said. She almost smiled. I thought you would. He stood up and went to the window. Outside, the afternoon light was going pale and long, and the north pasture was quiet. He thought about Robert Hayes riding out here alone, riding out without his men and without his authority and with a signed document in his coat. Something in that image was harder to dismiss than he wanted to admit. Are you all right? He asked. His back was still to her. Yes. A pause. No. Both. He heard her move the chair, her footsteps crossing the room. I don't know how to feel about forgiving someone who hasn't actually changed. Maybe can't change. I gave him a door, and he walked through it, but I don't know what's on the other side for him. That's his part, Ethan said. Not yours. I know. She came to stand beside him at the window, not close enough to touch, just beside him, the way she'd stood beside him in the yard when her father came. I keep thinking about what my grandmother used to say. She said the hardest thing a person learns is the difference between forgiveness and trust. You can give one without the other. Your grandmother was smart. She was the smartest person I ever knew. A pause. Until recently. He looked at her. She was looking out the window. Don't, he said. Don't what? Don't compliment me and then look at the pasture. It's a cowardly angle. She turned and looked at him directly. And there was something in her face that was absolutely clear. No armor, no careful level voice, no composed management of what she was feeling. Just Charlotte. Just her. You are the most stubborn, most principled, most aggravating person I have ever met, she said. And you are the reason I said yes when he asked if I was happy. That's what you are to me. And I know you told me not to say it in the middle of something, but the middle seems to be where we live, so I'm saying it now. He looked at her. The fire was low. The light was failing. The account books were on the table, and the signed agreement was in her hand. And 40 acres of leased Wyoming ground sat outside the window, carrying a water rights claim filed in his name, and the whole improbable accumulated weight of the last 7 weeks sat in the room with them like a third person. He said, I told your father you found your own way here. You did, she said. I heard you. That was true. I need it to stay true. Whatever this is. He gestured a small gesture between them. I need it to be yours. Your choice. Not because you needed someone to stand in front of your father. Not because you were grateful. Ethan. Her voice was very steady. I walked a mile through a blizzard. I read your account books. I pulled a calf out of ice water. I rode to Cheyenne and retained a lawyer and wrote a letter to my father that took 40 minutes and 2 corrections. She held his gaze. I have been making my own choices every single day since I walked through your door. This one is mine too. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, all right, just that. All right. The way he said most things plain and without decoration and meaning everything it was supposed to mean. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. That's all I get. All right. What do you want? Something slightly more. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a small gesture. Careful, the kind of gesture made by a man who doesn't make gestures carelessly. And he looked at her and said, I haven't wanted to stop this since the first morning you sat at that table and told me I was being robbed. She blinked. That's much better. Don't get used to speeches, he said. I won't, she said. I've learned to read the silences. He dropped his hand, looked at the window again. The lease is safe, he said. The water rights are filed. Your father signed. That's 3 things. 3 very important things. I want to buy the land, he said. Not with your money. Not yet. I want to earn enough to make a real offer to hatch. Might take another year. I know. But when I do, he paused, looked at her. I'd like you to still be here. It was the most he'd said about the future in 7 weeks. She knew the size of it. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Not dramatically. Not as a vow. Just as a fact, the kind of fact you state when it's simply true, and stating it is enough. He nodded once. Then he went to add wood to the fire because the evening was coming in cold, And there was always the next thing, and some things you do without saying, because they're just how you live. You keep the fire going, you fix what's broken, you build what you can. And she went back to the account books. The following weeks had a rhythm to them that was different from the weeks before. Not easier. Easier wasn't quite the word, because the work was the same, and the cold was the same, and the challenges of the property didn't pause for anyone's emotional developments. But the tension that had lived in the space between them, the careful management of it, the deliberate not naming was gone. What replaced it was something quieter and more solid, like a fence post that's been set right. It doesn't announce itself. It just holds. They fell into a pattern without discussing it. Ethan handled the cattle and the exterior work. Charlotte managed the books and had taken over a section of the winter garden with a thoroughness that had produced results none of his tenants had ever managed. She'd written to a seed merchant in Denver about spring varieties. She'd written to 2 women in the county whose families had been farming here 20 years longer than anyone else, asking about soil and water and what grew well in the particular combination of altitude and dryness that characterized this part of Wyoming. She was building something. He could see it. Not just surviving building. Tom Briggs stopped him outside the feed store one morning and said without preamble, "She's been talking to Alderman's wife about crop rotation." "I know." Alderman's wife hasn't talked about crop rotation with anyone since her daughter moved to Denver 3 years ago. Tom looked at him with the expression of a man delivering information and commentary simultaneously. "You know what I'm saying." "I think so. I'm saying she's putting down roots, Ethan. Literal ones, the garden kind, and the other kind, too." He leaned on the counter. "Town's noticing." "I know the town's noticing." "Towns mostly come around. Mostly." He paused. "Mrs. Preston is still, she'll come around. She always does. She just takes longer than everyone else and needs to feel like it was her idea." He waved a hand. "Point is, things are different than they were." "Yes," Ethan agreed. "They are." Tom studied him. "You happy about that?" He thought about Charlotte at the table with the account books, Charlotte pulling a calf out of ice water, Charlotte saying yes without having to think about it, Charlotte standing beside him in the yard and meaning it. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Tom nodded like this confirmed something he'd already decided. "Good. That'll be $4 for the feed." The second twist came from a direction no one had predicted. Voss wrote in mid-March with a detail that had surfaced during the finalization of Charlotte's legal independence. In reviewing the Hayes family's land records, a routine part of securing the formal release, Voss's office had found something in the county registry. 40 acres of Wyoming land. The specific 40 acres currently leased by Ethan Walker. The land had been in dispute before Gerald Hatch purchased it. Disputed between the previous owner, a homesteader named James Carey, who had abandoned it in 1876, and the territory itself, which had claimed it under an abandonment statute. Hatch had bought it from the territory, but Carey's heirs had never formally relinquished. The abandonment claim had never been fully adjudicated. What this meant, what Voss laid out in careful legal language across 3 paragraphs, was that the sale to Hatch might itself be challengeable. And if it was challengeable, the land's legal status was more complicated than anyone had thought. And if the land's legal status was unresolved, Ethan read the letter 3 times. He brought it to Charlotte and she read it once. "The homestead claim," she said. "The original one, from Carey." He sat down. "Voss thinks if I file for an updated homestead claim under the current homestead statutes, which are different from what applied in 1876, I might be able to supersede both Hatch's unclear title and the territory's disputed claim." She looked up. "You could own this land." "Not certainly, not without a fight, but possibly." He looked at the letter. "Voss says it's a legitimate path, not a guaranteed one." "How long?" 6 to 9 months of filings, maybe a court hearing." He paused. "Voss estimates his costs at..." He named a figure. She didn't blink. "My grandmother's account." Charlotte. "Not a gift," she said immediately before he could form the argument. "Not a transaction, an investment." She leaned forward. "Ethan, this land, if you own it, if the homestead claim holds, this is the foundation. This is what everything else gets built on." He looked at her. "We," he said. She held his gaze. "You said you wanted me to still be here when you bought it. I intend to still be here. That makes it we." I was quiet for a moment. He thought about all the reasons it was complicated, the optics of it, the independence of it, what he'd said about earning it himself. He thought about 4 years of work. He thought about a woman who came to his fence post with nothing and built herself into part of this place in 7 weeks. He thought about the word we and how it sat in the room, not heavy, not demanding, just accurate. "It has to be a partnership," he said. "Legal, documented, half and half." She stared at him. "You want to give me half the land?" "If we pay for it together, it's half your land. That's not giving, that's accounting." He held her gaze. "You taught me to be precise about accounts." Something in her face did something that wasn't quite crying, and wasn't quite laughing, and was somewhere in between, which he had never seen from her before, and which meant he thought that he had said exactly the right thing. "Half and half," she said. "Half and half." She held out her hand across the table. He looked at it for a moment, that hand that had held wire taut in the cold and scrubbed cuts clean and written letters that dismantled powerful men's plans and managed account books that kept them from going under. He shook it. "Right then," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "Let's file the claim." He reached for the pen, and somewhere outside the early March wind was quieter than it had been all winter, as if the territory itself was settling, as if the long argument between the cold and the coming warmth was finally beginning to resolve, and the 40 acres sat around the small cabin like it had always known it was waiting for something and had simply been patient about it. Patient the way land is patient, the way the good things are. The homestead claim filing took 4 days in Cheyenne, not because it was complicated. Voss had done most of the groundwork already. Pulling the original Carey homestead records and the territory's abandonment filing and laying them side by side like a puzzle, whose solution had been sitting in a drawer for 6 years, waiting for someone to look. It took 4 days because the county land office moved at the pace of an institution that had never once been hurried by anyone and saw no reason to start. Ethan and Charlotte waited. They stayed at a proper boarding house, this time separate rooms, which Charlotte had arranged before Ethan could say anything about it, and which cost more than the way station, but came with actual meals and a landlady named Mrs. Geary who fed them both breakfast without asking questions, which Ethan appreciated more than he could say. On the second morning, waiting for Voss's clerk to return with the preliminary filing confirmation, Charlotte said, "My mother sent a letter." He looked up from his coffee. "When?" "It was at the boarding house when we arrived. Someone must have told her where we'd be." She turned the envelope over in her hands. "I haven't opened it yet." He waited. "My mother and I have a complicated history," she said. She's not cruel. She's practical. She married my father at 19 because it was the practical thing to do, and she has spent 40 years being practical about it." She set the letter on the table. "I don't know if she knew about the driver." "Do you want to know?" She looked at the letter. "Yes," she said. "And no." She picked it up and opened it. He watched her read it. Her face gave him very little. It rarely did when she was reading, but when she finished and set it down, something in her shoulders had changed. Not collapsed, just lowered slightly, like a held breath let go. She didn't know, Charlotte said. About the driver, about what the instructions actually were. She looked at the letter. "She says when she found out, she told my father he had gone too far. She says she told him that in 38 years of marriage, she had never been ashamed of him before." A pause. "She says she was ashamed of him." "Do you believe her?" "I think I do." She folded the letter carefully. "My mother has many qualities I find difficult, but dishonesty isn't one of them. She's practical enough not to bother with it." She tucked the letter into her coat. "She wants to visit, when things are settled. She says—" She stopped and looked at the window. "She says she'd like to see where her daughter is building something." He didn't say anything for a moment. "That's more than I expected from her," Charlotte said quietly. "Maybe she surprised herself too," he said. She looked at him. That quiet look she had, the one that meant she was turning something over, holding it up. "You always do that," she said. "Do what?" "Find the version of a thing that leaves room." She shook her head slightly. "Most people find the version that closes doors. You find the one that leaves them open." "I build fences for the living," he said. "I know the difference between something that keeps things out and something that keeps things in." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and said, "The clerk should be back within the hour." "Probably," he said. And they waited the way they had learned to wait together, without filling the silence with things it didn't need. The filing confirmation came on the fourth day. Mrs. Folsom, the same county recorder who had processed Ethan's water rights claim 2 months earlier, stamped the homestead application and handed him the receipt with the same professional neutrality she'd handed him the first one. If she remembered him, she gave no sign. If she had opinions about a cowboy filing a homestead claim on disputed land with a Hayes woman standing 3 feet behind him, she kept them filed somewhere else. "Processing takes 60 days minimum," she said. "If there's a counterclaim from the territory or from Hatch's heirs, you'll be notified. If there's no counterclaim after 90 days, the claim advances to adjudication." And adjudication. A judge reviews the documentation and rules on validity. Given the original abandonment dispute, she paused. "It'll likely go before Judge Aldridge. He's handled 3 similar claims in the past 2 years. He's fair." She looked at him over her glasses. "He also has no patience for delay tactics. If someone tries to drag it out, he tends to respond poorly to that." "Good to know," Ethan said. "Good luck, Mr. Walker." She looked at Charlotte. "Miss Hayes." Charlotte blinked. "You know who I am." "I know who everyone is," Mrs. Folsom said pleasantly. "It's a small territory." She turned back to her files. "Good luck to you both." They rode home in 2 days. The weather held, which felt like something the land was offering them after months of pushing against everything. The road was clear and cold, and the sky was the deep winter blue that came in late March when the worst of it was done, but the warmth wasn't committed yet. On the second day, an hour from home, Charlotte said, "What do you want the property to be when it's ours?" I thought about it in the way he thought about things he cared about carefully from the ground up. More cattle. The north section could support a second herd if the water rights are used right. I'd like to expand the garden. What you've started is good, but there's more ground that could be productive. He paused. A better barn. The one we have is holding, but it won't hold forever. And the cabin. He was quiet for a moment. "What?" she said. "Been thinking about the cabin," he said. "It's 12 years old, and it leaks in 2 places, and the floor is soft in the corner by the door." "I noticed the floor." "I thought you probably had." He watched the road. "I'd like to build something new, not big, but right." A pause. "Something that's meant to last." She was quiet for a moment. "How long would that take?" "A year. Maybe 18 months if we're doing the land work at the same time." "So the cabin for now." "The cabin for now." She nodded. "I can live with the cabin." Another pause. "For the record, the leaking spot is above the east window. It's the 4th shingle from the left. I checked last time it rained." He looked at her sideways. "You checked the roof." "I looked out the window and counted. I couldn't get up there myself, the ladder's too short." She met his eyes. "I was going to tell you." He almost smiled. 4th shingle from the left. 4th from the left. He turned back to the road. "I'll fix it this week." "I know you will," she said. Like it had never been a question. They came home to find Tom Briggs's boy sitting on the fence at the gate. He was maybe 14, Tom's youngest, and he had the look of someone who had been given a job and was taking it seriously. He slid off the fence when he saw them coming and held out an envelope. "Pa sent this," he said. "Said it was urgent and to wait for you." Ethan took it. He opened it on horseback and read it while the boy waited. Then he read it again. "What is it?" Charlotte asked. He handed it to her. It was a letter from Hatch. Not to Ethan. To Tom Briggs, who Hatch had apparently decided was the appropriate channel for communicating something he didn't want to put in a direct letter. Tom had copied the relevant portions in his own hand. Hatch was selling, not the 40 acres, all of his Wyoming holdings. He was moving to Kansas where his son-in-law had a business and he was liquidating everything. The 40 acres was included in the sale, all of it going to a single buyer who had made a cash offer for the full package. The buyer's name was not in the letter, but the closing date was in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Charlotte said. Before the homestead claim can advance to adjudication, Ethan said. She looked at him. Someone found out about the filing. Or someone's been watching Hatch's situation and moved fast when the opportunity came. He took the letter back. Either way, if this sale closes before the claim adjudicates, the new owner takes the land and the claim becomes a dispute between you and a buyer who paid cash. She thought rapidly. Voss needs to know today. I know. He can file for a stay, a temporary hold on the sale pending the claim adjudication. It's possible. It's not certain, but it's possible. She was already turning her horse. Ride to the telegraph office. Wire Voss tonight. The office closes at 5. Then ride faster. He looked at the position of the sun. He looked at her. Go home, he said. Get the property documents together, every filing, every receipt, all of it. I'll be back by dark. She didn't argue. She turned toward the cabin. He kicked Rye into a run. The telegraph went out at 4:47. Voss's response came the following morning. 11 words. Filing for emergency stay today. Keep all documents. Trust the claim. Voss. Ethan read it to Charlotte over breakfast. She set down her fork. He thinks it'll hold. He thinks it's worth fighting for. That's not quite the same thing. No, he agreed. But it's enough. She picked up her fork again. Who's the buyer? Voss is finding out. I have a guess, she said. He looked at her. It's too fast, she said. Too well timed. Someone who knew about the homestead filing, knew about Hatch's situation, moved within days of both. She looked at her coffee. My father has been quiet for 3 weeks, since he signed the agreement. You think he found a way around it. I think my father is a man who, when a door closes, looks for a window. She met Ethan's eyes. The agreement says he won't interfere with the lease. Buying the land outright is arguably not interfering with the lease, it's replacing it. He thought about that. If he owns the land, you'd be his tenant, she said, not Hatch's. And the agreement I have covers independence and non-interference. It doesn't specifically prohibit him from acquiring property you currently occupy. She paused. He had lawyers look at the language. I'd bet on it. Ethan sat back. He looked at the window. He thought about Robert Hayes riding out alone with a signed agreement and the expression of a man who had decided to be better. He thought about what Charlotte had said. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if he's telling me what he actually believed or what he needs to believe now. Turned out the answer mattered. Voss will know today, he said. Yes. If it's your father. If it's my father, she said, then he didn't come out here to make peace. He came to buy time. Her voice was very steady. And the letter I wrote him, the one that gave him the door, he used it to walk through and come around the back. He watched her face. There was grief in it. Not surprise. Just grief, the particular grief of a person whose worst suspicion about someone they love has turned out to be correct. Charlotte. She shook her head once. I'm all right. She wasn't quite. But she was the kind of person who got herself there, who took the hit and found her feet and stood up. Let's wait for Voss. Voss's full letter arrived 2 days later, and it was worse than either of them had guessed. The buyer wasn't Robert Hayes. It was a land company called Crandall Western Properties. Crandall. Charlotte's grandmother's maiden name. Charlotte read the letter standing at the table, and her face went through several things very quickly. Shock first. Then something colder. Then something that was the expression of a person working through the implications of something deliberate and careful and very precisely aimed. He used her name, she said. Ethan said nothing. He set up a land company in my grandmother's name. She set the letter down. The account the money I withdrew for Voss, my father found out about it. He found out about the account. How? Aldrich, she said. The banker. My father has relationships with every bank in the territory. He wouldn't have needed much, just a conversation, just confirmation that the account existed and who had accessed it. She pressed both hands flat on the table. He's using her name to make it look like a family company, like I'm connected to it, like the money we're using to fight him is somehow part of his operation. It muddies the claim, Ethan said. It does more than that. She straightened. If Crandall Western Properties is connected to my grandmother's account, and I used that account to fund the homestead claim, then the claim itself could be challenged as being funded by the same entity that's buying the land. She looked at him. Do you understand he's trying to make it look like we're on the same side? Like this is all one arrangement. He understood. It was elegant in the way that ugly things are sometimes elegant, precisely designed, carefully constructed, aimed exactly where it would hurt the most. Not violence, not bluster. Something worse. Something that used the truth as a weapon by bending it just enough that it didn't look bent. Voss, he said. Yes. She was already moving to the desk. I need to write to Voss right now. Charlotte? She stopped. Breathe, he said. Not unkindly, just directly. She looked at him. Then she took a breath. Then another. She put both hands on the back of the chair. He planned this from the beginning, she said. Coming out here alone, signing the agreement, all of it. Her voice was very quiet. He let me think he was choosing better. And the whole time. Maybe not the whole time, Ethan said. She looked at him. Maybe he came out here meaning what he said. Maybe he went home and sat with it for a week and decided he couldn't hold to it. He paused. Men like your father don't always start lying. Sometimes they start true, and then the habit takes over. That's not better, Ethan. No, he agreed. It's not. But it's different. And different matters when you're deciding what to do next. She looked at him for a long moment. What do I do next? Write to Voss, he said. And then I need you to write one more letter. To who? Your mother. She went very still. Why? Because your mother said she was ashamed of your father, he said. And because a woman who says that to a man like Robert Hayes in her own house after 38 years of marriage, is a woman who has decided something. He looked at Charlotte steadily. And because Crandall is your grandmother's name, your mother's mother, and your mother might have something to say about that. The room was very quiet. Charlotte's face did something he hadn't seen before. Not the almost laugh, not the quiet certainty, not the composed steadiness. Something that was simply human and raw and real. The face of a daughter who had been told the truth about her father by a man who had barely known him, and found that the truth was more complicated and more painful than she'd let herself believe, and was standing up to it anyway. You think she'll help, Charlotte said. I think she might want to, he said. That's different from knowing, but it's worth the letter. She sat down. She pulled paper toward her. She wrote to Voss first. 4 pages, precise and documented and devastating in the way her writing always was when she was certain of what she wanted to say. Then she stopped. She sat with a blank page in front of her for a long moment. Then she wrote to her mother. He didn't ask what she said. It wasn't his to know. Margaret Hayes arrived on a Thursday. She came in a good carriage with a single driver, not 3 men, not a show of force, just a carriage and a woman in her late 50s, who stepped down with the particular posture of someone who had been sitting straight her entire life and had found it a useful habit. Margaret Hayes was smaller than Ethan had imagined. He'd built an image from Charlotte's descriptions, sharp, precise, practical, and the image had been bigger somehow. But she was compact and fine-boned, and her eyes were exactly Charlotte's eyes, and she moved with an efficiency that he recognized because he saw it every day. Charlotte went to meet her at the gate. They didn't embrace immediately. They stood looking at each other, a mother and daughter who had 40 years of understanding and being misunderstood between them. And then Margaret Hayes reached out and put one hand on her daughter's face, just briefly, and Charlotte closed her eyes for 1 second. Then Margaret looked at Ethan. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Mrs. Hayes, I've heard a great deal about you." Her voice was even, assessing, the voice of a woman who formed opinions quickly and held them firmly and occasionally changed them when the facts required it. "Most of it, I believe." "I appreciate that," he said. She looked at the property, at the cabin, at the garden Charlotte had started along the south wall and the patched fence and the cattle visible in the north pasture. She looked at all of it with the eyes of a woman who had grown up on a ranch and knew exactly what she was looking at. "It's well kept," she said, "for 40 acres. "It'll be more than 40, Charlotte said, "if the claim holds." Margaret looked at her daughter. "That's why I'm here." They went inside. Margaret Hayes spent 2 hours at the table with Voss's letters and the property documents and her own considerable knowledge of Wyoming land law, which turned out to be extensive in the way that the knowledge of women who are not supposed to involve themselves in business often is acquired quietly over years through careful attention to everything that was discussed in rooms she was present in. She knew about the Carey homestead. She'd known about the abandonment dispute for years. Her husband had tried to acquire the land himself in 1879 and been blocked by the unresolved title. He had moved on to other acquisitions and not mentioned it again. She knew about Crandall Western Properties. That was the moment the room changed. "You knew," Charlotte said. "I found the incorporation papers in your father's desk 3 weeks ago," Margaret said. Her voice was completely even. "I was looking for something else. I found those." She paused. "I knew what they meant." "And you didn't." "I wrote to you the next day," Margaret said. "The letter you received in Cheyenne." Charlotte stared at her mother. "You said you wanted to visit." "I said I wanted to see where my daughter was building something." Margaret folded her hands on the table. "I needed to see it myself before I decided what to do." She looked around the cabin at the account books, the garden notes pinned to the wall, the water rights receipt. Ethan had framed and hung by the door because Charlotte had told him to. "I've decided." The room waited. "My mother's name," Margaret said, "is not a weapon, not for anyone, not even for Robert." She looked at Charlotte. "I have spent my entire marriage being practical. I have accepted a great many things in the name of practicality." Her voice didn't waver. "I will not accept this." "What are you going to do?" Charlotte asked. "I'm going to speak to a lawyer in Cheyenne," Margaret said. "My own lawyer. Not your father's, not yours. Mine." She paused. "I have my own resources. Your grandmother was not the only careful woman in the family." She looked at Ethan. "The land company was incorporated using my mother's name without my knowledge or consent. That is grounds to challenge the incorporation itself. If the company is invalid, the purchase offer tied to it is invalid." Ethan looked at her. "That would void the sale." "Yes?" "And remove the conflict of interest argument against the homestead claim." "Yes." She met his eyes. "Mr. Walker, my husband is not a bad man. He has done bad things. There is a difference, and I have spent 40 years knowing both sides of it." She paused. "But what he did to Charlotte in that storm, and what he has done since using my mother's name, using my daughter's own resources against her, those are not things I can be practical about." Charlotte was looking at her mother with an expression Ethan had never seen from her. Not the steady composure, not the careful control. Something younger. Something that had been waiting a long time to see something and was finally seeing it. "Mother," she said, quietly. "Don't," Margaret said, not unkindly. "I'm not doing this for you to thank me. I'm doing it because it's right." She straightened her back, that lifelong habit of sitting straight. "Your grandmother would have done the same thing the first day." Charlotte said, "She would have done it faster." And Margaret Hayes almost smiled. "She would have had the lawyer's name before breakfast." The legal challenge to Crandall Western Properties Incorporation was filed within the week. Voss and Margaret's lawyer, a woman named Ada Cole, no relation to Harrison Cole, who turned out to be one of 3 female lawyers practicing in Wyoming Territory, and who Voss said was the sharpest contract reader he'd encountered in 20 years, worked together on the filing. It took 4 days of documentation and 2 telegrams to the Territorial Incorporation Office, and 1 very pointed letter to the judge overseeing the land purchase. Robert Hayes's response was silence. Not the silence of a man regrouping. The silence of a man who had been outmaneuvered by his wife, his daughter, and 2 lawyers, and who understood for the first time in 40 years of being a man of consequence. That consequence ran in more than one direction. The land purchase was frozen, pending the incorporation challenge. The homestead claim advanced to adjudication. Judge Aldridge, who had no patience for delay tactics, set the hearing for May. May came to Wyoming with the particular violence of a season that had been held back too long. Everything was happening at once. The land greening up after months of cold, the cattle needing management, the garden. Charlotte had started along the south wall, coming up in ways that surprised even her. Spring in Wyoming was not gentle. It was a shove, an insistence. Ethan fixed the 4th shingle from the left on the east side of the roof. He also fixed the floor in the corner by the door. He did both of these things on a Saturday, while Charlotte was at the table with Ada Cole's latest correspondence, and when he came back inside, she looked up at him with flour on her hands from the bread she'd been making between letters. "Floor's done," he said. She looked down at it, stood up, and walked across it. "It doesn't creak," she said, as if this was surprising. "I fixed it. The old one always creaked." "I know. That's why I fixed it." She looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked at him. "You fixed the floor before we know if we'll own it." "Yes." "Why?" He crossed to the stove and poured coffee. "Because the floor needed fixing," he said. "Because I live here. Because some things you do regardless of the paperwork." She watched him for the moment. "I've been thinking about the new house," she said. "When we build it." He turned. "I'd like it to face east," she said. "So the kitchen gets the morning light." A pause. "And I'd like a porch, wide enough for 2 chairs." He looked at her. "I know we haven't talked about the specifics," she said. "But if we're going to build something that lasts, I want to know what we're building." She held his eyes. "And I want 2 chairs on the porch." He set down the coffee cup. "2 chairs," he said. 2 chairs. He was quiet for a moment. Then, east-facing, wide porch. What else? A proper kitchen. Not one wall, an actual kitchen. She was almost smiling. "And I want the bedroom window to look at the north pasture. I like watching the cattle in the morning." "You watch the cattle?" "Every morning, from the east window." She tilted her head. "You didn't know that." "No. There are things you don't know yet," she said. "There are things I don't know about you yet either. I look forward to finding out." She said it plainly. Not as a romantic declaration, as a statement of fact. The way she said things, she was certain of. He picked up the coffee cup again, turned back to the stove. "The kitchen can face east," he said. "The bedroom window, I'd have to look at the foundation options. The slope on the north side is tricky." "You'll figure it out," she said. "Probably." "You always do," she said, and she went back to her letter. The hearing was on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of May. Judge Aldridge was exactly as Mrs. Folsom had described, a compact man with a gray beard and eyes that moved through documents with the focused speed of someone who had read too many of them to be impressed by anyone. He cleared his docket for the morning and read every filing in the Walker Homestead claim and the Crandall Western Properties challenge, while Ethan and Charlotte and Voss and Ada Cole sat in the 4 chairs in front of his desk. He asked 11 questions, each one precise, each one aimed at a specific point in the documentation, the way a hammer is aimed at a specific nail. Voss answered 8. Ada Cole answered 2. Charlotte answered 1. The one Aldridge asked her directly, "Miss Hayes, the account held under the Crandall name, you accessed it as the documented secondary holder." "Yes, Your Honor." "And the land company incorporated under the same name, you had no knowledge of or connection to it?" "None," she said. "My grandmother died in 1879. I became secondary holder of her account in 1878 at her request, documented through her attorney of record at the time. I have never had any involvement in any land company. I was not consulted, informed, or connected to the incorporation of Crandall Western Properties in any capacity. Aldridge looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the documents again. Then he made a note. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Aldridge recessed for 40 minutes. When he came back, he stood, which apparently he always did, when he had something decided, and he read from the notes in front of him in a voice that did not inflect for drama because it had no need to. The Crandall Western Properties Incorporation was invalid, the name having been used without the consent of any living heir or documented representative of the Crandall estate. The purchase offer tied to the company was therefore void. The homestead claim filed by Ethan Walker on the 40-acre property, currently designated as the Walker lease, was valid under current territorial homestead statutes. The prior abandonment dispute having been resolved through the Carey heirs' formal relinquishment, which Voss had found, had actually been filed in 1880 and simply never cross-referenced in the records. The claim would advance to provisional title pending a 2-year residency confirmation. Provisional title. 2 years from the filing date. The land was not yet fully his, but it was in every practical and legal sense on its way to being his. And no one could buy it, sell it, or take it in the meantime. Ethan sat very still in his chair for a moment. Then he looked at Charlotte. She was looking at the judge's desk. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her back was straight, and her face was doing that thing again. That thing that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite laughing. He had learned by now that this was what she looked like when something real happened. Something she hadn't let herself believe in fully until it was sitting in front of her, unavoidable. He reached over and put his hand over hers. She turned her palm up and held on. They walked out of the courthouse into a May afternoon that was doing everything May was supposed to do. The light was long and the air smelled like new grass, and even Cheyenne, which Ethan generally preferred to leave, looked decent in it. Voss shook their hands with the efficiency of a man who had appointments. Ada Cole shook their hands with the warmth of a woman who had genuinely wanted this result and was pleased to have achieved it. Then both lawyers went back to their offices, and it was just the two of them on the courthouse steps in the May light. Charlotte looked at the street. Then she looked at Ethan. 2 years, she said. 2 years, he confirmed. And it's ours. Ours, she said, testing the word, finding it solid. That's a strange word. Gets less strange, he said. She looked at him. Does it? So I've heard. He settled his hat. Ready to go home. She said it without hesitation. No pause, no qualification, no searching for the right framing. Just home, as if the word had belonged to her for months, and she'd simply been waiting for the moment to use it out loud. They rode back in a day and a half. The weather held the whole way, which Ethan had stopped taking for granted, and started simply accepting the way you accept the good things when they come without demanding explanations from them. On the last stretch of road with the property visible ahead, the cabin and the garden and the patched fence and the north pasture and all 40 acres of it sitting in the late afternoon light, like something that had been waiting patiently. Charlotte said, I've been thinking about something. What? About what you said in the way station, that first night on the way to Cheyenne. She looked at him. You said you'd spent your whole life trying to find something worth keeping. I'm paraphrasing. I didn't say it like that. You said it in the way you say things, which is without decoration and with everything implied. She held his gaze. I've been thinking about the fact that you found the land first, that the land was always what you were building toward. Yes, and then I walked up to your fence post, she said, and you fixed the floor before you owned it. And you filed the water claim before you knew if it would hold, and you turned down the envelope on the first day. She paused. You weren't looking for me. You were looking for the land, and you got both. He was quiet for a moment. Is that a question? I'm wondering if you'd have it any other way. He looked at the property ahead, at the east-facing wall where the kitchen would go, at the north pasture where the bedroom window would look, at the 2 chairs on the porch that didn't exist yet, but would. No, he said, I wouldn't. She nodded once, settled it, filed it away in the place where she kept the things she was certain of. They rode through the gate and home. That evening, after the horses were tended and the fire was going and the account books were closed for the night, Ethan Walker stood at the door of the cabin and looked out at the 40 acres of Wyoming ground that was conditionally on its way to being his. Charlotte came to stand beside him. They stood there in the quiet of the May evening, and the land was very still around them, and the sky above was the deep clear blue that only comes when the day has been good, and somewhere in the north pasture a calf called once and was answered. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "2 chairs on the porch." "I know." "Soon." "Soon," he said. She leaned her shoulder against his, the way a person leans against something they trust to hold, not dramatically, not as a statement, just the quiet animal certainty of knowing where the solid thing is and resting against it. He let her. They stood there until the stars came out over Wyoming, over the 40 acres, over everything they had built, and everything they were still building. And the night settled around them, like something that had been waiting a long time to arrive, and was finally exactly where it was supposed to be. Some things you earn. Some things you fight for. Some things arrive half-frozen at your gate in the worst storm of the year, and change the entire shape of your life without asking permission. But the things that last, the things that hold through winter and drought, and the particular cruelty of powerful men, and the longer cruelty of time, those are never found. They are built. 1 post, 1 fence, 1 honest word at a time, by people who kept their word when it cost them something, and stayed when staying was hard, and chose every single day to be the kind of person the land deserved. That is the only fortune worth having, and Ethan Walker and Charlotte Hayes had earned every inch of it.